They say an alpha who never learned to love will die alone in his own castle. King Rowan Vale proved them right the night his Luna walked out and never looked back. Years of cold command, endless wars, and a throne built on discipline, all of it shattered the moment Celine Ashford appeared at the Grand Summit with another man's mark burning on her throat. This is the story of a king who lost everything because he was too proud to see what stood right beside him. Stick around until the end to find out if a heart broken by neglect can ever be made whole again. And if this story hits different, smash that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know where my pack is watching from. The war room still smelled like blood and burned maps when Rowan finally allowed himself to sit. His commanders had left an hour ago, their boots echoing through stone corridors as they carried out his orders. Outside the narrow windows, snow fell over the Northern Empire's capital like ash from a funeral pyre. He pressed his knuckles against the table, feeling the old scars pull tight across his hands. Celine should have been here. She always attended the strategy meetings, standing silent near the back wall with her arms crossed, watching everything with those sharp gray eyes. She caught details he missed, remembered grudges he forgot, and twice she had saved his life by noticing poison before it reached his cup. But her chair had been empty for 3 weeks now. Rowan told himself it didn't matter. Luna or not, Celine was bound to the Empire by oath and blood. She would return when her temper cooled. She always did. In 15 years of standing at his side through rebellion, assassination attempts, and political nightmares that would have broken lesser wolves, Celine had never truly abandoned her post. He was certain she wouldn't start now. The door opened without a knock. His head of security, Marcus Trell, stepped inside with the kind of expression that usually preceded bad news. The man was built like a stone wall and twice as hard to move, but right now he looked uncomfortable in a way Rowan had never seen before. "What is it?" Rowan said flatly. Marcus cleared his throat. "My king, we've received word from the southern border. The Black Crescent Pack is moving through our territories under diplomatic clearance, so let them pass. We have a treaty." "They're headed to the Grand Summit," Marcus continued, and his voice dropped lower. "Alpha Kale Draven is bringing a Luna." Rowan felt something cold slide down his spine. He kept his face blank, his posture controlled, but his wolf stirred beneath his skin like a beast waking from a long sleep. "And why does that concern me?" Marcus hesitated, then pulled a folded parchment from his coat. "A scout sent this. It's a roster of confirmed attendees for tomorrow's gathering." Rowan took the paper and scanned the list. His eyes stopped halfway down. Next to Kale Draven's name, written in formal script, was a single line that made the room tilt sideways. Luna Celine Draven. He read it again, then a third time. The letters didn't change. "There has to be a mistake," Rowan said quietly. Marcus shook his head. 3 separate sources confirmed it. She arrived at Black Crescent territory 4 weeks ago. The bond ceremony was private, but the mark is visible. Everyone who's seen them says it's legitimate. Rowan's hand crushed the parchment into a tight ball. His claws extended without permission, shredding the paper into ribbons that fell across the table like snow. The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive, as his power leaked out in waves that made the torches flicker. "Get out," he said. Marcus didn't argue. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Rowan alone with the ruins of his composure. For a long time he didn't move. He stood there in the center of the war room, surrounded by maps of territories he had conquered and held through sheer will, and felt the foundation of his world crack apart beneath his feet. Celine was gone. Not temporarily, not in anger. She was bonded to another alpha, marked and claimed in a way that couldn't be undone. The mate bond was sacred, absolute, and Rowan had seen what happened to wolves who tried to break it. Death was the kindest outcome. His wolf howled inside his chest, a sound of rage and loss so profound it nearly drove him to his knees. For 15 years, Celine had been his. Not in the way a mate should be, he had never allowed that, but she had been his Luna, his partner, the steady presence that kept his empire from tearing itself apart, and he had never once told her what she meant to him. Rowan's fist slammed into the stone wall hard enough to split his knuckles. Pain flared bright and clean, a welcome distraction from the hollow ache spreading through his ribs. He hit the wall again, then again, until blood smeared across ancient stone and his hands went numb. When he finally stopped, breathing hard, his reflection stared back at him from the darkened window glass. He looked like a stranger. His eyes were wild, his jaw tight, and for the first time in decades, King Rowan Vale had absolutely no idea what to do next. The Grand Summit took place in neutral territory, a massive stone fortress built into the mountains where 5 major packs could meet without starting a war. Rowan arrived with his full retinue, 20 of his best warriors flanking him as he walked through the arched entrance into the main hall. The space was already crowded. Alphas from across the continent stood in clusters, their lunas beside them, all dressed in formal regalia that displayed their pack colors and status. Conversations hummed through the air, a mix of politics and veiled threats wrapped in polite language. Rowan felt every eye turned toward him as he entered. He was used to that. As the Alpha King of the Northern Empire, he commanded respect through reputation alone. His wars were legendary, his discipline feared, and his refusal to show weakness had made him untouchable. But today, the stares felt different. There was curiosity in them, and something else. Pity, maybe, or anticipation. They all knew. He kept his expression carved from ice as he moved through the crowd, nodding to allies and ignoring enemies. His wolf was a caged storm inside him, snarling and clawing to get out. But Rowan had spent a lifetime mastering control. He wouldn't break now, not in front of the entire continent. Then the far doors opened and the room fell silent. Kael Draven walked in first. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with black hair and the kind of predatory grace that came from years of surviving impossible fights. The Black Crescent Pack had a reputation for brutality, and Kael embodied every dark story whispered about his people. But it wasn't Kael who made Rowan's heart stop. Celine walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore a deep blue gown that brought out the silver undertones in her hair, and her posture was straight, confident, utterly unbothered by the sea of staring faces. She looked exactly the same as she always had, sharp features, calm expression, the quiet strength that had carried his empire through every crisis. Except for one thing. On the left side of her throat, just above her collarbone, a mate mark glowed faintly beneath her skin. It was fresh, still burning with the magic of a newly completed bond, and it marked her as Kael's in a way that no ceremony or oath ever could. Rowan couldn't breathe. His vision narrowed to that single point of light on her neck, and the world around him ceased to exist. She had done it. She had actually done it. Kael's gaze swept the room and landed on Rowan. The Black Crescent. Alpha's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. A challenge, maybe, or a warning. Then Celine looked up and her eyes met Rowan's across the crowded hall. For a moment, time stopped. Rowan saw recognition flash across her face, followed by something that might have been sadness or regret. But then her expression smoothed into perfect neutrality, and she looked away as if he were just another face in the crowd. That hurt worse than anything. Someone touched his arm. Marcus stood at his shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "My king, you need to breathe." Rowan realized he had stopped moving. He forced air into his lungs and continued walking, heading toward the council dais at the front of the hall, where the senior alphas would gather for the formal proceedings. But his eyes kept drifting back to Celine. She stood beside Kael with the ease of someone who belonged there. When an elder alpha approached to offer congratulations, Kael introduced her with obvious pride, his hand settling protectively on the small of her back. Celine smiled, a real smile, not the polite mask she had worn in Rowan's court. And something inside Rowan's chest shattered into smaller pieces. He had never made her smile like that. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. In 15 years, through countless battles and victories and moments that should have brought them closer, Rowan had never once made Celine look happy. He had given her duty, responsibility, and endless work. He had kept her at arm's length because emotions were weakness, and love made rulers vulnerable. And now she stood beside another man, glowing with contentment he had never bothered to provide. The summit proceedings began, but Rowan barely heard a word. He sat in his designated seat among the Council of Alphas, maintaining the appearance of attention while his mind spiraled into chaos. Every time he glanced toward the Black Crescent delegation, Celine was there, steady and composed, listening to Kael with genuine interest when he spoke. During the first break, Rowan watched as Kael leaned down to whisper something in her ear. Celine laughed softly, her hand coming up to rest against his chest in a gesture so intimate it made Rowan's wolf roar with jealous fury. He stood abruptly, needing air, needing space, needing anything but this torture. But before he could escape, a familiar voice stopped him cold. Rowan. He turned slowly. Celine stood 3 feet away, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. This close, he could see the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders held tension despite her calm demeanor. Luna Celine, he said, and the formal title tasted like poison. Something flickered across her face. Just Celine is fine. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 15 years of unspoken words. Around them, other delegates pretended not to watch while hanging on every word. You left, Rowan said finally. His voice came out rougher than he intended, without warning, without explanation. I left a note, Celine replied quietly. You didn't read it. He hadn't. When Marcus told him she was gone, Rowan had found the sealed envelope on her desk and thrown it into the fire without opening it. He told himself her reasons didn't matter, that she would return when she was ready. He had been wrong. What could you possibly have written that would justify this? Rowan gestured vaguely toward her neck, toward the mark that proved she belonged to someone else now. Celine's eyes hardened. Justify? I spent 15 years standing beside you, protecting your throne, bleeding for your empire. I never asked for gratitude or recognition. I only wanted one thing, Rowan. Just one. What? The word came out sharper than he meant. I wanted you to see me, she said simply, not as your Luna or your strategist or your political asset, as someone worth caring about. The truth of it hit him like a blade between the ribs. He opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he possibly say? That he had seen her all along but was too afraid to admit it? That vulnerability terrified him more than any battlefield? That he had pushed her away because losing her would have destroyed him? Celine watched him struggle, and for a moment her expression softened into something that might have been pity. Then she stepped back, putting distance between them. I hope you find what you're looking for, Rowan, she said quietly. I really do. But it won't be me. Not anymore. She turned and walked away before he could respond, returning to Kael's side as if their conversation had been nothing more than a polite exchange between old colleagues. Rowan stood frozen in the middle of the crowded hall, watching her go, and finally understood the price of his pride. He had lost her, not to death or betrayal or politics, but to his own stubborn refusal to let anyone close enough to matter, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The summit lasted 3 more days. Rowan endured every second of it, maintaining his mask of cold authority while his world collapsed internally. He watched Celine from across conference tables and formal dinners, cataloging every small difference between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. She laughed more. She spoke with confidence in front of the assembled alphas, offering insights that made even his enemies nod with respect. And most damning of all, she looked at Kael the way Rowan had always secretly hoped she would look at him, with trust, affection, and the kind of partnership that couldn't be forced or commanded. On the final night, a celebration banquet filled the great hall with music and wine. Rowan sat at the high table, picking at food he couldn't taste, when Kael Draven approached with 2 goblets in hand. The Black Crescent Alpha set 1 cup in front of Rowan and took the seat beside him without asking permission. For a long moment, neither spoke. She talks about you sometimes, Kael said finally. His voice was low enough that no one else could hear. Late at night, when she thinks I'm asleep. She wonders if you ever noticed when she was gone. Rowan's hand tightened around his goblet. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to understand something, Kael continued, turning to face him directly. That woman survived 15 years of being invisible to the one person who should have cherished her most. She didn't leave you because she stopped caring. She left because caring was killing her. The words hit like hammer blows. Rowan forced himself to meet Kael's gaze, seeing none of the gloating he expected. Instead, the other alpha looked almost sad. I didn't steal her, Kael said quietly. You threw her away. And I'm grateful for it, because she's the best thing that ever happened to me. But don't mistake gratitude for cruelty. If you had shown her even a fraction of the devotion she showed you, she never would have looked at another man. Rowan's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. And what exactly do you want me to do with that information? Nothing, Cale said, standing. It's too late for anything else. I just thought you should know what you lost. He walked away, leaving Rowan alone with his thoughts and a growing certainty that he had destroyed the best part of his life through sheer stupidity. Hours later, when the celebration finally ended and most guests had retired, Rowan found himself standing on one of the fortress's outer balconies, staring at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. The cold air bit through his formal coat, but he welcomed the discomfort. Behind him, a door opened. He didn't turn, already knowing who it was by the familiar cadence of her footsteps. Couldn't sleep? Celine asked, moving to stand beside him at the railing. Not particularly. They stood in silence, shoulders almost touching, gazing out at the darkness. For a moment it felt like old times. The two of them standing watch together after everyone else had gone to bed, guarding an empire that never stopped trying to tear itself apart. I meant what I said earlier, Celine said softly. I do hope you find happiness, Rowan. You deserve it, even if you don't believe that. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, memorizing every detail because he knew this would be the last time. The moonlight caught in her hair, turning it silver. The mate mark on her throat pulsed gently, a constant reminder of what he had lost. I don't know how to be happy, he admitted, the words dragging themselves out of some deep place he usually kept locked. I only know how to survive, how to conquer, how to maintain control. But happiness? That was never part of the plan. Celine's expression softened with understanding. I know. That's why I left. Did you ever love me? The question escaped before he could stop it, raw and desperate and completely unlike anything the cold Alpha King would normally ask. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so softly he almost missed it, she said, every single day. Even when you made it impossible. Even when you looked right through me. I loved you so much it broke me into pieces I'll spend years putting back together. The confession should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a death sentence. I'm sorry, Rowan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to love you back. I'm sorry for all of it. Celine reached out and touched his hand briefly, a ghost of the contact they might have shared in another life. I know you are. But some things can't be fixed with apologies, Rowan. Some damage is permanent. She pulled away and walked toward the door, pausing only once to look back at him. The man standing on that balcony looked nothing like the untouchable king who had ruled the Northern Empire with an iron fist. He looked lost, broken, and utterly alone. Goodbye, Rowan, Celine whispered. Then she was gone, and he was left standing in the cold with nothing but his regrets for company. The journey back to the capital took 4 days. Rowan rode in silence, ignoring his commander's attempts at conversation. When they finally reached the palace, he went straight to his private chambers and locked the door behind him. The room looked exactly as he'd left it. Maps covered every surface, battle reports stacked in precise piles, weapons hung on the walls in perfect order, everything neat, organized, controlled, everything except the gaping wound in his chest that refused to stop bleeding. Rowan moved through his quarters like a ghost, touching objects that suddenly felt meaningless. The crown sitting on its velvet cushion, the ceremonial sword that had been passed down through 8 generations of Vale kings, the treaties and declarations and symbols of power that had once defined his entire existence. None of it mattered anymore. He found himself standing in front of a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He hadn't opened it in years, hadn't wanted to face what it contained. But tonight, with Celine's goodbye still echoing in his ears, he pulled out the key and turned the lock. Inside were pieces of a life he had tried to forget. Letters Celine had written during the early years, before she learned he wouldn't read them. Small gifts she had given him on occasions he barely acknowledged. A scarf she had knitted during one brutal winter, soft and warm and completely impractical for a warrior king. At the bottom of the cabinet, wrapped in cloth, was a single portrait. He lifted it carefully, hands trembling, and stared at the image of a younger Celine painted shortly after she became his Luna. The artist had captured her perfectly, the intelligence in her eyes, the slight smile that suggested she knew secrets worth keeping, the quiet strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. He had commissioned this portrait himself, then hidden it away because looking at it made him feel things he couldn't afford to feel. Rowan sank to the floor, still clutching the painting, and for the first time in 30 years, the Alpha King of the Northern Empire allowed himself to weep. He cried for the woman who had loved him despite his coldness. He cried for the years he had wasted building walls instead of bridges. He cried for the future he had destroyed through pride and fear and an absolute refusal to be vulnerable. And when the tears finally stopped, when he sat exhausted and hollow on the stone floor of his chambers, Rowan made a decision. He couldn't have Celine back. The mate bond was sacred and unbreakable, and even if it wasn't, she deserved the happiness she had found with Kyle. But that didn't mean he had to stay the same man who lost her. If he couldn't change the past, he would change himself. Starting tonight. Rowan stood slowly, setting the portrait back in its place with careful reverence. Then he unlocked his chamber door and called for Marcus. His head of security arrived within minutes, looking surprised to be summoned so late. "My king?" "Gather the council," Rowan said. "Emergency session at dawn. We're making some changes." "What kind of changes?" Rowan met his gaze steadily. The kind that should have been made years ago. The emergency council session started just as the sun rose over the capital. All 15 members of the Royal Advisory Board sat around the table, confusion evident on every face. Rowan had never called an unscheduled meeting without a crisis forcing his hand. This time, the crisis was entirely internal. "I'm stepping back from absolute rule," Rowan announced without preamble. "Effective immediately, all major decisions will require council approval. I will remain Alpha King, but this empire will no longer function as a dictatorship." Silence. Then pandemonium. Arguments erupted from every corner of the table. Some council members accused him of weakness. Others questioned his sanity. A few looked genuinely concerned that their king had suffered some kind of mental break. Rowan let them shout themselves hoarse. When the noise finally died down, he continued in the same calm tone. "For years, I believed that strength meant control, that caring about anything or anyone was a liability. I built this empire on discipline and fear, and it worked. We're powerful, stable, and feared across the continent." He paused, making eye contact with each council member in turn. "We're also alone, cut off from allies because I refused to show any vulnerability, resented by our own people because I demanded obedience without offering compassion. And I personally drove away the one person who kept this entire kingdom from collapsing into chaos." The eldest council member, a white-haired wolf named Evander, spoke carefully. "My king, if this is about the Luna—" "It's about everything," Rowan cut him off. "Celine's departure was the catalyst, but the problems run deeper. I've been so focused on being unbreakable that I forgot how to be human. That ends now." Over the next hour, Rowan laid out a series of reforms that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Power sharing with the council, regular audiences where citizens could bring grievances directly to their leaders, diplomatic outreach to pacts they had previously treated as beneath them. It wasn't weakness, it was evolution. Some council members remained skeptical, but others began to see the wisdom in his proposals. By midday, they had reached a tentative agreement to implement the changes gradually, with checkpoints to assess what worked. When the meeting finally ended, Rowan felt lighter than he had in weeks. The empire wouldn't transform overnight, but at least he had started moving in the right direction. Marcus caught him on the way out. "That took courage, my king." Rowan shook his head. "Courage would have been changing before I lost everything that mattered. This is just survival. Still, it's more than most leaders would do. Maybe. But it's too late to fix what I broke." He left the council chambers and made his way through the palace, noting details he had ignored for years. The servants who flinched when he passed, the guards who stood so rigidly they barely seemed alive, the general atmosphere of fear that permeated every stone corridor. How had he never noticed? Or had he simply not cared? Rowan found himself in the Luna's quarters without consciously deciding to go there. Celine's rooms had remained untouched since her departure, preserved exactly as she left them by servants who didn't know what else to do. He pushed open the door and stepped into what felt like a tomb. Her scent still lingered faintly in the air, mountain snow and night-blooming flowers. Books lay scattered across her desk, notes tucked between pages where she had been researching something. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the windowsill, the liquid long since evaporated. Rowan moved through the space slowly, running his fingers along surfaces she had touched. He found her weapons collection, immaculately maintained, her formal Luna robes carefully hung and probably never worn because she preferred practical clothing. A small box of letters from allies she had cultivated on his behalf. On her bedside table, he found a journal. He shouldn't have opened it. Reading someone's private thoughts was a violation, and he had violated Celine's trust enough for one lifetime. But his hands moved of their own accord, flipping to the last entry dated 3 days before she left. The handwriting was precise, controlled, so unlike the emotional chaos of the words themselves. I'm so tired of being invisible. I would give anything to matter to him, just once. To be seen as more than a tool he uses to maintain power. But I'm starting to realize that's never going to happen. Rowan doesn't believe in love. He barely believes in loyalty beyond what can be enforced through duty. And I can't keep destroying myself for someone who will never care if I disappear. Rowan's hand shook as he read. The entry continued for another page, detailing specific moments where she had hoped for recognition and received only dismissal. The final line hit hardest of all. Maybe it's time to find out what I'm worth to someone who actually wants to find out. He closed the journal carefully and set it back exactly where he found it. Then he sank onto the edge of her bed, head in his hands, and confronted the full weight of what he had done. She had been drowning right beside him, and he never even noticed. News of Rowan's reforms spread quickly through the empire. Some praised his newfound wisdom. Others whispered that losing his Luna had broken the Alpha King's mind. But regardless of opinion, change was coming to the Northern Empire, whether people liked it or not. 2 weeks after the summit, Rowan received a formal invitation to the bonding celebration for Alpha Kyle and Luna Celine. The ceremony would take place in Black Crescent territory in 1 month, and representatives from every major pack were expected to attend. Marcus argued that Rowan shouldn't go, that watching Celine formally bind herself to another man would be too painful. But Rowan overruled him. He needed to see it, needed to witness what real love looked like, even if it destroyed him in the process. So when the day came, he traveled south with a small honor guard, crossing into Black Crescent territory under diplomatic banners. The landscape changed as they rode, mountains giving way to dark forests filled with ancient trees and shadowed valleys. The Black Crescent pack had a reputation for ruthlessness, but Rowan found their territory surprisingly beautiful. Villages dotted the forest, their people greeting the northern delegation with cautious courtesy. Children played in the streets, wolves hunted in the woods, and everything had the feel of a place where people actually wanted to live rather than simply survive. Celine had found a good home. The thought brought both comfort and renewed pain. The bonding ceremony took place in a massive clearing surrounded by torches. Thousands of wolves gathered to witness their Alpha and Luna formalize the bond that had already been marked into their skin. Rowan stood near the back of the crowd, trying to remain inconspicuous despite being one of the most recognizable alphas on the continent. Then Celine appeared, and the entire world fell away. She wore a gown the color of midnight, simple and elegant, with her hair braided back to display the glowing mate mark on her throat. She moved through the crowd with confidence, smiling at friends and accepting congratulations with genuine warmth. She looked happy. Truly, completely happy in a way Rowan had never seen. Kale waited at the center of the clearing, dressed in formal alpha regalia, but wearing the same expression Rowan had never allowed himself. Pure, uncomplicated joy at seeing his mate. When Celine reached him, Kale took her hands and said something that made her laugh, and the assembled wolves cheered. The ceremony itself was beautiful. An elder priestess spoke words about partnership, trust, and the sacred nature of the mate bond. Kyle and Celine exchanged vows, promising to stand beside each other through every challenge, to be each other's strength and sanctuary, to choose each other every single day. Everything Rowan should have done 15 years ago. When they sealed the bond with a kiss, power rippled through the clearing like thunder. The mate mark on Celine's throat blazed bright enough to light the darkness, matched by a mirror mark appearing on Kael's skin. The crowd roared its approval, and somewhere in the chaos, Rowan felt the last thread connecting him to Celine snap cleanly in two. She belonged to someone else now, completely, irrevocably. And he would spend the rest of his life knowing he had no one to blame but himself. The celebration continued into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Rowan nursed a single glass of wine and watched from the shadows, observing the woman he loved dance with her new husband, while an entire pack celebrated around them. He should have left, should have made his excuses and returned to his empty palace where he could mourn in private. But something kept him rooted in place, unable to look away. At some point, Celine left Kael's side and began making rounds through the crowd, thanking guests personally for attending. Rowan knew she would eventually reach him, and he didn't know what he would say when she did. When she finally appeared in front of him, her expression was carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, I'm glad you could make it." The formal title felt like a wall between them. "Congratulations," Rowan said quietly. "You look happy." "I am," Celine said simply. "Kael is everything I never knew I needed." The words weren't meant to hurt, but they did anyway. Rowan forced himself to maintain composure, to not let his pain show on his face. "I've been making changes," he found himself saying, "in the Empire, sharing power with the Council, listening to people instead of just commanding them, trying to become the kind of leader who actually deserves loyalty rather than demanding it through fear." Celine studied him for a long moment, and something soft flickered in her eyes. "That's good, Rowan. I'm proud of you." The simple statement of approval felt like absolution he didn't deserve. His throat tightened dangerously, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "I never told you," he said, the words coming out rough and unsteady. "But you were the best part of my life. The only good thing in decades of darkness. And I was too stupid and scared to admit it until you were gone." Celine's expression cracked slightly, revealing the pain underneath. "Rowan, don't—" "I know it doesn't change anything," he continued, needing to say this while he still had the courage. "I know you're happy now, and I'm glad, truly. But I needed you to hear it at least once. You mattered. You always mattered. And losing you broke something in me that will never fully heal." Tears gathered in Celine's eyes, but she blinked them back. A few feet away, Kael watched them with quiet understanding, ready to intervene if needed, but giving his mate space to handle this herself. "I hope you find peace, Rowan," Celine whispered. "I hope you learn to love yourself enough to let someone else love you. Because you deserve that, even if you don't believe it." "Maybe someday," Rowan said. "But not today. Today, I'm still learning how to live with what I lost." They stood there for another heartbeat, the history between them heavy as iron chains. Then Celine reached out and squeezed his hand once, a brief moment of connection that felt like goodbye all over again. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "You too, Luna Celine." She returned to Kael's side, slipping easily into his embrace like she had always belonged there. The Black Crescent. Alpha met Rowan's gaze over her head, and some unspoken understanding passed between them. A recognition that they both loved the same woman, but only one of them had been brave enough to show it. Rowan turned away before he could watch them dance again. He found Marcus near the edge of the celebration and gave the signal. Time to go. The journey back to the Northern Empire was silent and long. By the time they reached the palace, dawn was breaking over the capital in shades of gold and pink. Rowan went straight to his chambers, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical travel. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his desk and began writing. Letters to allies he had neglected, reforms that needed to be implemented, a list of people he had wronged who deserved apologies he might never be able to give. Somewhere in the middle of the night, Marcus knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission. The security chief set a bottle of expensive whiskey on the desk and poured 2 glasses. "To painful lessons," Marcus said quietly, raising his glass. "To learning them too late," Rowan replied and drank deeply. They sat in companionable silence as the sun rose higher, 2 wolves who had seen too much and understood that some wounds would never fully close. But as daylight filled his chambers, Rowan felt something unexpected stirring beneath the grief. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too strong a word, but maybe a distant possibility that someday, years from now, the pain would fade to a manageable ache, that he could build something worth having from the ruins of his mistakes, that the Alpha King who lost everything might eventually become the man who deserved better. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep breathing, and sometimes breathing was enough. 3 days later, disaster struck from a completely unexpected direction. Rowan was reviewing trade agreements when Marcus burst into the war room without knocking, his face pale. "My king, we've intercepted urgent intelligence from our network in the south. There's a plot." "What kind of plot?" "Assassination," Marcus said grimly. Multiple rival packs have formed a secret alliance. They're planning to strike during the Blood Moon Gathering next week. The Blood Moon Gathering was a sacred event where all packs gathered under neutral banners to honor ancient traditions. Violence during the gathering was forbidden by laws so old no one remembered their origin. Breaking that peace would mean war with everyone. "Who's the target?" Rowan demanded. Marcus hesitated, and in that hesitation Rowan already knew. "Luna Selene," he said quietly. "They believe killing Kael's mate will fracture the Black Crescent Alliance and destabilize the entire southern region." The world tilted sideways. Every muscle in Rowan's body went rigid as his wolf surged against his control, roaring its fury at the threat against Selene. She might belong to another man now. She might be lost to him forever, but Rowan would burn the continent to ash before he let anyone hurt her. "Get me everything," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Names, locations, planned attack vectors. I want to know every detail within the hour. My king, our attendance at the gathering isn't mandatory. We're going," Rowan cut him off coldly. "And we're bringing every loyal fighter we can spare. If anyone tries to touch her, they'll have to go through me first." Marcus nodded and rushed out to mobilize their forces. Alone in the war room, Rowan pressed his palms against the table and tried to steady his breathing. He had lost Selene to his own stupidity. He could never get her back, but he would die before he let someone take her from the world entirely. Even if she never knew, even if she never thanked him, even if protecting her meant nothing in the grand scheme of their broken history. Some loves didn't require reciprocation. Some loves were worth dying for regardless of the outcome. And Rowan was about to prove exactly what he should have shown her 15 years ago, that Selene Ashford was worth protecting at any cost, even if it killed him. The war room filled with bodies within the hour. 20 of Rowan's best fighters stood around the table, their faces grim as Marcus laid out maps showing the route to the Blood Moon Gathering. Intelligence reports covered every surface, names and locations circled in red ink that looked too much like blood. Rowan studied the information with cold precision, his mind already calculating angles of attack and defensive positions. The assassins had chosen their moment carefully. During the gathering, security would be relaxed because of the ancient peace laws. Everyone would be vulnerable, distracted by ceremony and tradition. It was smart, brutal, but smart. "The question is how we move without starting a war," said Evander, the eldest council member. "If the Northern Empire arrives at a neutral gathering with a full military force, every pack will assume we're planning an invasion. Then we'll arrive as a diplomatic delegation," Rowan replied. 20 warriors, myself included. Small enough to seem reasonable, large enough to actually protect what matters. "And what exactly matters, Your Majesty?" another council member asked carefully. "Luna Selene is no longer our concern. She belongs to the Black Crescent Pack now." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Rowan's eyes went flat and dangerous, his wolf pressing against his skin hard enough that power leaked into the air like poison gas. "Say that again," Rowan said quietly, and every warrior in the room tensed. The council member paled but held his ground. "I only meant that we have no obligation to—" "Selene spent 15 years protecting this empire," Rowan cut him off, his voice sharp as broken glass. "She bled for us. She sacrificed for us. She held this kingdom together when I was too blind and stupid to see what I had. So if you think for one second that I'm going to let her die because she's not technically my Luna anymore, you're even dumber than I was." Silence. Marcus cleared his throat carefully. "The king is right," he said. "Setting aside personal feelings, Luna Selene has more strategic intelligence about northern politics than anyone alive. If she dies, that information could be extracted by whoever claims her body. We have a vested interest in keeping her breathing." It wasn't the real reason, but it gave everyone an excuse to agree without questioning Rowan's judgment. Within minutes, they were making plans. Supply lists, travel routes, contingencies if the assassins struck before they arrived. Rowan absorbed every detail while part of his mind remained fixed on a single image. Selene's throat cut open, her blood soaking into sacred ground while he stood too far away to stop it. Not going to happen. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he would keep her alive, even if she never knew who saved her. They left before dawn, 20 wolves on horseback moving fast through territories that still bore the scars of old wars. Rowan pushed them hard, sleeping only a few hours each night, driven by urgency he couldn't fully explain to his fighters. Marcus rode beside him, occasionally glancing over with the kind of concern that came from decades of friendship. "You're going to burn yourself out before we even arrive," he said quietly. "Then I'll burn out after," Rowan replied without slowing. "Is this about protecting an ally, or is this about something else?" Rowan didn't answer immediately. The truth sat heavy in his chest, tangled up with grief and regret, and a desperate need to prove something to a woman who would never care. "Both," he finally said. "Everything. Does it matter?" Marcus considered that. "I suppose not. Just don't get yourself killed trying to save someone who chose to leave." The words stung because they were fair. But fairness had stopped mattering somewhere between watching Celine dance with her new husband and learning someone wanted her dead. On the third day of hard riding, they crossed into neutral territory. The sacred grounds were marked by ancient standing stones carved with symbols older than any living pack. Hundreds of wolves had already gathered, their camps spreading across the valley like a temporary city. Rowan's delegation arrived quietly, taking up position on the northern edge where they could observe everything. He sent scouts to gather information while he studied the layout, noting weak points in security and places where an assassin could strike without being immediately noticed. The gathering itself was set to begin at sunset. Until then, various packs mingled under the wary supervision of the peacekeepers, a neutral force tasked with preventing violence during the ceremony. "Not enough of them," Marcus muttered, watching a dozen peacekeepers try to monitor several hundred wolves. "They're spread too thin." "Which is exactly what the assassins are counting on," Rowan agreed. "Chaos, distraction, and a target who won't expect an attack during sacred proceedings." "Do we warn the Black Crescent Pack?" Rowan considered it. If they warned Kyle, he would increase security around Celine, making her harder to reach. But he would also potentially tip off the assassins that their plot had been discovered, causing them to either abort or change tactics in ways Rowan couldn't predict. "No," he decided. "We handle it ourselves. Quietly. If the assassins move, we stop them before they get close. And if we fail, then I die making sure they fail too." Marcus didn't argue. He simply nodded and went to position their fighters strategically around the gathering grounds. They would blend in, appear to be normal attendees, while actually forming a protective perimeter around the Black Crescent delegation. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, wolves started moving toward the ceremonial circle. Rowan spotted Kale first, the Black Crescent Alpha walking with the confident stride of someone who didn't know death was planning to visit. Then Celine appeared beside him, and Rowan's breath caught despite his best efforts. She wore ceremonial robes in deep green, her hair braided with silver thread that caught the fading light. The mate mark on her throat glowed softly, visible even from a distance. She looked calm, poised, completely unaware of the danger circling closer with every passing moment. Rowan's wolf snarled, demanding they grab her and run, carry her somewhere safe, and never let her out of sight again. But the human part of him knew that would accomplish nothing except terrifying her and potentially triggering the exact violence they were trying to prevent. So he stayed in the shadows and watched, every muscle coiled tight with readiness. The ceremony began with traditional songs, ancient words spoken in languages most wolves no longer understood. Alphas and Lunas formed circles, their hands joined in symbolic unity. The blood moon rose overhead, massive and red, casting everything in shades of crimson that looked prophetic. Rowan divided his attention between the ceremony and the crowd, searching for anything out of place. A figure moving wrong, a wolf who didn't belong. Any sign that... There, near the eastern edge of the circle, 3 wolves stood too close together, their body language tense despite their casual postures. Rowan recognized the stance of fighters preparing to move, that particular alertness that came from knowing violence was about to erupt. He caught Marcus's eye and gestured subtly. His security chief nodded once, already adjusting positions to intercept. The ceremony continued. An elder peacekeeper stepped into the center of the circle, preparing to bless the assembled packs. Celine stood beside Kyle, her head bowed respectfully, completely vulnerable. The 3 suspicious wolves began moving, splitting up to approach from different angles. Smart. Harder to stop multiple attackers converging simultaneously. Rowan signaled his fighters. They drifted through the crowd like smoke, positioning themselves to intercept. But there were too many people, too much movement, and the assassins were professionals who knew how to use chaos as cover. One of them got through. Rowan saw the blade a heartbeat before it would have struck Celine's exposed back. Time slowed to a crawl as his body moved on pure instinct, crossing 20 feet in seconds that felt like years. He hit the assassin from the side, a full-body tackle that sent them both crashing into the crowd. People screamed and scattered as the two wolves rolled across sacred ground, fighting for control of the knife. The assassin was good, trained and fast, but Rowan was an alpha king who had survived 3 decades of war. He caught the wrist holding the blade and twisted hard enough to snap bone. The knife clattered away as the assassin howled in pain. Around them, chaos exploded. Marcus and the other fighters engaged the remaining 2 assassins while peacekeepers rushed toward the violence, shouting orders that no one could hear over the screaming. Rowan pinned the first assassin to the ground, his claws extended and pressed against the wolf's throat hard enough to draw blood. "Who sent you?" he snarled. The assassin just smiled, showing teeth stained red. "Too late, King. Look around." Rowan's head snapped up. While everyone had been distracted by the first attack, more assassins had emerged from the crowd. Not 3, not 5, a dozen at least, all moving toward Celine with coordinated precision. They had counted on him stopping the first wave. They had used it as a distraction to position the real attack. Kale saw them coming and moved to protect his mate, but he was one alpha against overwhelming numbers. He fought viciously, taking down 2 attackers before a third slashed across his ribs, forcing him back. Celine stood frozen in the center of the circle, surrounded by advancing killers, and Rowan was too far away. His wolf roared inside his chest, a sound of absolute fury that tore from his throat and echoed across the valley. Power erupted from him in waves, the full force of an Alpha King's dominance slamming into every wolf within range. Half the assassins dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by the weight of his command. But the others kept coming, either strong enough to resist or simply too committed to stop. Rowan ran. He covered the distance in great leaping strides, using bodies as stepping stones when the crowd was too thick. An assassin reached Celine first, blade raised for a killing strike, and Rowan threw himself between them without thinking. The knife meant for her heart punched into his shoulder instead. Pain exploded bright and sharp, but Rowan barely felt it. He grabbed the assassin by the throat and squeezed until bones cracked, then threw the body aside and turned to face the next attacker. They came at him in a wave. 4 assassins, all armed, all aiming to get past him to the woman standing frozen at his back. Not happening. Rowan fought like something feral and ancient, all pretense of civilization abandoned. Claws tore through flesh, teeth found throats. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a predator who had forgotten how to lose, taking wounds he barely noticed in exchange for keeping them away from Celine. Blood soaked into sacred ground, turning the earth dark and sticky. Bodies fell around him as he carved a circle of protection around the one person who mattered more than his own survival. An assassin got lucky, driving a blade deep into Rowan's side. He felt ribs crack, felt something vital tear, but he couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying, and dying meant Celine dying, and that was unacceptable. He caught the assassin's arm and broke it backward, listening to the scream of agony like music. Another attacker lunged, and Rowan met them head-on, trading blow for blow until they both went down in a tangle of limbs and violence. Somewhere distant, he heard Marcus shouting orders, heard Kyle roaring as he fought his way toward his mate, heard peacekeepers finally mobilizing to contain the chaos. But Rowan's world had narrowed to a single purpose: survive long enough to keep Celine breathing. The final assassin came at him from the side, a curved blade aimed at his throat. Rowan was too slow, too injured, too exhausted to block it completely. The edge caught him across the chest, opening a line of fire from shoulder to sternum. He went down hard, his vision graying at the edges. Through the fog of pain, he saw the assassin step over his body, saw the blade rise toward Celine one last time. No. Rowan lunged upward with the last of his strength, catching the assassin's ankle and dragging them down. They fell together into blood-soaked earth, and Rowan drove his claws into the wolf's chest and didn't stop until the heart stopped beating. Then he collapsed, his body finally giving up after being pushed far beyond any reasonable limit. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Celine's face above him, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. For him. Itas. Rowan woke to pain. It wrapped around him like chains, pulling him back to consciousness through sheer insistence that his body still existed and currently regretted every decision he had ever made. He tried to move and immediately wished he hadn't. Fire shot through his ribs, his shoulder, his chest. Everything hurt with an intensity that suggested critical damage poorly repaired. "Don't," a familiar voice said quietly. "You'll tear the stitches." Rowan forced his eyes open. Marcus sat beside the bed looking exhausted and worried. They were in a tent somewhere, medical supplies scattered across a nearby table. "How bad?" Rowan managed to rasp out. "Bad enough. You lost a lot of blood, cracked 4 ribs. The shoulder wound nearly hit an artery. The chest wound definitely should have killed you, but didn't." "But didn't," Marcus agreed. "The healers say you'll recover if you actually rest instead of doing stupid things like fighting a dozen assassins alone." "Celine," Rowan said, the name scraping his throat raw. "Alive, unharmed. Kale took some damage, but nothing fatal. Between your warning and your suicidal heroics, we stopped them all." Relief flooded through Rowan so intense it almost hurt worse than the injuries. She was alive. Nothing else mattered. The door of the tent opened and Kale Draven stepped inside. The Black Crescent Alpha looked like he had gone several rounds with a meat grinder, bandages visible beneath his torn clothing, but he was standing, which was more than Rowan could say for himself. The 2 alphas stared at each other for a long moment. Then Kyle moved closer, pulling up a chair across from Marcus. "You saved her life," Kyle said quietly. "Multiple times from what witnesses reported." "Why?" "Because she's worth saving," Rowan replied simply. "Because the world is better with her in it. Because letting her die when I could prevent it would have destroyed whatever small piece of humanity I have left." Kyle studied him with those dark, assessing eyes. "You love her." It wasn't a question, but Rowan answered anyway. "Every day of my life. I just realized it too late." "She knows what you did," Kyle said. "Everyone knows. Half the continent watched the Northern Alpha King nearly die protecting a Luna who isn't his." "Good," Rowan said, meaning it. "Let them know. Let her know that even if I failed at everything else, I didn't fail at keeping her alive." Silence settled between them, not hostile, but heavy with understanding. 2 wolves who loved the same woman, acknowledging the impossible situation without pretending it wasn't real. "She wants to see you," Kyle said finally. "I told her to wait until you were stronger, but Celine doesn't take orders well." "She never did," Rowan said, and something that might have been a smile crossed his bloodied face. "It's one of the things I loved most about her." Kale stood, moving toward the tent entrance. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm glad you were there, and I'm sorry you had to be." Then he was gone, leaving Rowan alone with Marcus and the wreckage of his body. "She's going to come in here," Marcus said after a moment, "and she's going to ask questions you probably don't want to answer. Probably." "Are you going to tell her the truth?" Rowan thought about that. About 15 years of pushing her away because he was terrified of vulnerability. About watching her marry someone else. About the moment he realized he would rather die than let anything happen to her. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I will." Marcus nodded and stood, stretching his back. "I'll give you privacy. Try not to say anything that makes her punch you. You're in no condition to take a hit right now." He left, and Rowan was alone with his thoughts and the steady throb of pain that reminded him he was still breathing. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time felt strange, stretched thin by blood loss and exhaustion. Then the tent flap opened again, and Celine stepped inside. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a borrowed cloak that was too large for her frame. Her eyes were red like she had been crying, and the mate mark on her throat pulsed with visible agitation. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the space of the tent. "You're an idiot," Celine finally said, her voice shaking. "Yeah," Rowan agreed. "Probably." She moved closer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You could have died. You almost did die. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that I've already lost you once," Rowan said quietly. "I wasn't going to lose you permanently because I was too much of a coward to do what needed doing." Tears spilled down Celine's cheeks, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to push me away for 15 years and then throw yourself in front of assassins like my life is worth more than yours. It is, Rowan said simply. To me, it always has been. I just never had the courage to admit it until it was too late. Celine sank into the chair beside his bed, her face crumpling. I watched you fight them. I watched you take wounds meant for me. I watched you refuse to go down even when you should have been dead. And all I could think was that I should have said something different at the bonding ceremony. Should have told you that I understand now, that I know how hard it is to be vulnerable when you've spent your whole life being strong. Rowan wanted to reach for her hand but wasn't sure he had the right. What would you have said? She looked at him then, her gray eyes filled with pain and confusion and something that might have been lingering affection. That I'm proud of you, that the changes you're making in the Northern Empire take more courage than any battlefield victory. That even though I'm bonded to Kael and I love him, there will always be a part of my heart that remembers loving you first. The confession hit him like another blade to the chest. Celine? No, she cut him off. You need to hear this. Because I think we both need to close this chapter properly instead of leaving it bleeding between us forever. She took a shaky breath, composing herself. You were my first love, Rowan. My first everything. And for a long time, I thought that if I just proved myself valuable enough, if I just worked hard enough and sacrificed enough and made myself indispensable, you would finally see me, finally choose me. But that's not how love works. You can't earn it like a battlefield promotion. It has to be freely given or it's not real. I know that now, Rowan said quietly. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're still trying to prove something. Still trying to earn redemption through dramatic gestures instead of accepting that some things just can't be fixed. Maybe, Rowan admitted. Or maybe I'm trying to become the person I should have been all along. The person who protects what matters instead of taking it for granted. Celine studied him for a long moment, and he could see her thinking, processing, trying to reconcile the cold king she remembered with the bleeding wolf who had nearly died to keep her safe. I forgive you, she said finally, for all of it. The neglect, the dismissal, the years of feeling invisible. I forgive you, Rowan. Not because you earned it, but because holding on to anger was destroying me from the inside. Relief and grief tangled together in Rowan's chest. Thank you, he whispered. But forgiveness doesn't mean I can come back, Celine continued gently. I'm bonded to Kael now. I love him. He sees me in ways you never could, and he makes me happy in ways I didn't know were possible. That's not going to change. I know, Rowan said, and meant it. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm just asking you to believe that I finally understand what I lost, and that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the second chance you'll never give me. Tears fell faster down Celine's face, and this time she did reach out, taking his uninjured hand in both of hers. I believe you, she said, and I hope you find someone who can give you what I couldn't. Someone who can handle your edges without bleeding. Someone who makes you want to be soft. Maybe someday, Rowan said, but not soon. They sat like that for a while, hands joined, two people who had loved each other terribly and imperfectly, finally making peace with what could never be. Eventually, Celine stood. She leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, a benediction and a goodbye all at once. Take care of yourself, Alpha King, she whispered. You too, Luna Celine. She left quietly, taking with her the last fragments of hope Rowan hadn't realized he was still carrying. In the silence that followed, he closed his eyes and let the exhaustion pull him under. His body needed rest, time to heal from wounds that went deeper than skin and bone. But before unconsciousness claimed him, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. He had saved her. He had kept her alive. And if that was the only contribution he could make to her happiness, then it was enough. It had to be enough. Recovery took weeks. The healers warned him to stay in bed, but Rowan was back on his feet within days, moving stiffly through the camp while his body slowly repaired itself. The story of what happened at the Blood Moon gathering spread like wildfire across the continent. The Alpha King who nearly died protecting a Luna who no longer belonged to him. The dramatic rescue that violated every political calculation but felt right in ways politics never could. Some called him a hero, others called him a fool. Rowan didn't particularly care about either assessment. Messages arrived from across the empire, some praising his actions, some questioning his judgment. A few from allies who wanted to know if this meant he was finally learning to care about something beyond power. Maybe, he wrote back to those. Or maybe I always cared and was just too broken to show it properly. Kael visited him twice more before the northern delegation left. The conversations were awkward but necessary. Two alphas establishing boundaries and grudging respect. She talks about you sometimes, Kael admitted during their final meeting. Late at night, she says you were braver than she gave you credit for. Tell her I said thanks, Rowan replied. And tell her I meant what I said. She's worth protecting. I will, Kael promised. And for what it's worth, you're not the villain in this story. You were just a man who didn't know how to love until it was too late. Most of us can relate to that. The words brought unexpected comfort. Rowan had spent weeks convinced he was the monster in Celine's story, the cold king who deserved nothing but contempt. But maybe he was something more complicated. Maybe he was just broken in ways he was only now learning to repair. The journey back to the Northern Empire was slow, hampered by Rowan's injuries and the need to maintain diplomatic appearances. But eventually, they crossed back into familiar territory, and the capital rose before them like a stone monument to everything he was trying to change. The council greeted him with a mixture of relief and frustration. Half of them wanted to throw a celebration for his survival. The other half wanted to lecture him about the stupidity of nearly dying for political complications. Rowan listened to all of it with patience he had never possessed before. When they finally finished, he stood slowly, his ribs protesting the movement. I'm not the same king who left here 3 weeks ago, he said quietly. I don't expect you to understand that yet. But I'm asking you to trust that the changes I'm making aren't about weakness or loss of control. They're about becoming the kind of leader our people actually deserve. And what kind is that? Evander asked carefully. One who protects what matters instead of taking it for granted, Rowan said. One who admits when he's wrong. One who understands that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites, they're partners. The council exchanged glances, uncertain but not hostile. Over the following weeks, Rowan continued implementing reforms. Some worked better than expected. Others failed spectacularly and had to be adjusted. But slowly, incrementally, the Northern Empire began to shift. People noticed the changes. Servants stopped flinching when he passed. Guards relaxed their rigid postures. Citizens started bringing grievances directly to the palace instead of suffering in silence. It wasn't transformation. It was evolution. And Rowan found himself able to breathe in ways he never had before. Late one night, 3 months after the assassination attempt, Marcus found him on a balcony overlooking the capital. The city sparkled below them, thousands of lights marking homes where people slept without fear. You're healing, Marcus observed, not talking about physical injuries. Slowly, Rowan agreed. It's harder than I expected. Most worthwhile things are. They stood in comfortable silence, two old wolves watching over territory they had fought and bled to protect. Do you regret it? Marcus asked eventually. Loving her. Nearly dying for her. All of it. Rowan considered the question seriously. He thought about 15 years of pushing Celine away. Thought about watching her marry someone else. Thought about the moment he threw himself between her and death without hesitation. No, he said finally. I regret how I treated her when I had the chance to do better. But I don't regret loving her, even if it destroyed me. Some people are worth breaking for. Marcus nodded, accepting that. And now? Now I keep moving forward, Rowan said. I build something worth having. I become someone worth knowing. I stop trying to control everything and start learning how to just live. It was a simple answer to a complicated question. But Rowan was learning that sometimes the simple answers were the only ones that mattered. Far to the south, in Black Crescent territory, Celine stood on her own balcony and stared at stars that looked the same, no matter whose land you stood on. Kael's arms wrapped around her from behind, solid and warm and exactly where they belonged. You're thinking about him, Kael said, not accusing, just observing. Is that wrong? Celine asked quietly. No. He saved your life. He nearly died doing it. Those things matter. She leaned back against her mate's chest, feeling his heartbeat steady against her spine. I hope he finds peace. I think he will, Kael said. Eventually. The kind that comes from accepting what is instead of mourning what was. Celine closed her eyes and sent a silent wish into the night. directed at a king hundreds of miles away who had finally learned how to care just as he was learning how to let go. Be well, Rowan, she thought. Be whole. Be better. And somewhere in the darkness, carried on winds that crossed mountains and forests, and the spaces between past and present, perhaps that wish found its destination. Perhaps it didn't matter whether it did. Some stories didn't need resolution, just acknowledgement that they had been real and painful and worth the telling. This was one of those stories. And as the moon rose higher and stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, both Celine and Rowan settled into the truth that had taken years to accept. Love given too late could not erase the damage of years spent alone, but it could light the way forward for whatever came next. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 weeks after Rowan returned to the capital. It started small, barely noticeable. A trade route that suddenly closed without explanation. An ally who stopped responding to diplomatic correspondence. Border scouts reporting unusual troop movements near territories that had been peaceful for years. Rowan studied the reports in his war room, that old familiar unease crawling up his spine. Marcus stood beside him, his expression grim as he added another marked location to the map. "This isn't random," Marcus said quietly. "Someone is systematically isolating us. Who benefits from that? Everyone who ever resented northern dominance, which is half the continent." Rowan traced his finger along the map, following the pattern of disruptions. They formed a rough circle around the Northern Empire, tightening like a noose. Whoever was orchestrating this understood strategy, understood how to strangle an empire without firing a single shot. "Double the border patrols," he ordered, "and send messages to every remaining ally. I want to know who's still with us and who's already turned." Marcus nodded and left to carry out the orders. Alone in the war room, Rowan felt the weight of old instincts pressing against his attempts at change. The brutal king he used to be would have responded to this threat with overwhelming force, crushing potential enemies before they could fully mobilize. But that king had lost Celine. That king had nearly died alone in a pool of his own blood, surrounded by people who feared him but never truly followed him. So Rowan forced himself to think differently, to consider diplomacy before violence, to ask questions before making assumptions. It was harder than any battlefield he had ever faced. Over the following days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. 3 more trade agreements collapsed. A border dispute erupted into armed skirmishes. Anonymous threats arrived at the palace, promising destruction if the Northern Empire didn't withdraw from certain territories. The council convened an emergency session, their voices rising in panic and accusation. "This is what happens when you show weakness," one of the older members shouted. "You spend months implementing reforms and sharing power, and now our enemies think we're vulnerable. Or maybe our enemies always hated us, and we're just noticing now because we stopped being too arrogant to pay attention," Rowan shot back coldly. The argument continued for hours, accomplishing nothing except raising everyone's blood pressure. When the council finally disbanded, Rowan remained in the chamber, staring at maps that showed his empire slowly being carved into pieces by forces he couldn't identify. Evander approached quietly, the elderly wolf moving with careful deliberation. "May I speak plainly, Your Majesty?" "Always. You're trying to be the better man. I respect that. But sometimes the world doesn't reward better men. Sometimes it eats them alive and uses their bones to build monuments to cruelty." Rowan looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whoever is doing this knows you've changed. They're counting on your newfound conscience to slow you down while they position for the killing blow." The words hit like ice water. "So what? I go back to being the monster I was before? Prove everyone right about strength being the only thing that matters?" "No," Evander said thoughtfully. "You find a third option. You show that mercy and strength aren't opposites, that you can be kind without being weak, but you have to be willing to defend what you're building, or someone else will tear it down and claim they were just being realistic." The old wolf left Rowan alone with those thoughts, and for the first time in weeks, Rowan felt the shape of a plan beginning to form. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Rowan's youngest scouts, a wolf barely past his first transformation, requested an urgent audience in the middle of the night. Marcus wanted to turn him away, but something in the scout's expression made Rowan override the decision. The young wolf stood in the war room, trembling slightly but determined. His name was Eric, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Speak," Rowan said, not unkindly. "My king, I found something. I wasn't supposed to be in that part of the archives, but I was looking for old border maps and I saw files that didn't make sense. What kind of files? Eric pulled a stack of documents from his pack and spread them across the table. Financial records. Correspondence marked with official seals. Supply orders that dated back months, maybe years. Rowan scanned the pages, his blood slowly turning to ice. The documents showed a pattern of systematic embezzlement. Funds diverted from military accounts. Supplies redirected to unknown locations. Communications with rival pacts that promised cooperation in exchange for territory and power. And at the bottom of nearly every page, authorizing every transaction, was a signature Rowan recognized immediately. Evander's. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. The oldest member of his council, the advisor who had served 3 generations of Vale kings, had been systematically dismantling the Northern Empire from within for years. "How long have you known about this?" Rowan asked Eric, his voice dangerously quiet. "I only found them tonight. I came straight here." Marcus had moved closer, reading over Rowan's shoulder. His face went pale as he absorbed the implications. "This can't be right. Evander has been loyal since your grandfather's reign." "Apparently not," Rowan said flatly. He picked up one particular document, a letter written in Evander's precise hand, detailing exactly how to exploit the Northern Empire's recent reforms to create instability. The old bastard had been playing both sides, encouraging Rowan toward change, while simultaneously using that change to destroy everything from the inside. It was brilliant in its cruelty. The worst part was realizing how thoroughly Rowan had been manipulated. Every piece of advice Evander had given, every suggestion about mercy and reform and finding a third path, had been designed to make the Empire vulnerable at exactly the right moment. "We need to arrest him immediately," Marcus said, "before he realizes we know." "No," Rowan replied, his mind already working through possibilities. "If we move now, we tip our hand to whoever he's working with. We need to know the full extent of the conspiracy before we act. And how do we do that without alerting him?" Rowan thought for a moment, then made a decision that felt like swallowing glass. "We feed him false information, make him think his plan is working even better than expected, and we follow the trail back to everyone involved." "That's dangerous," Marcus warned. "If he suspects for even a moment, then I'll deal with him the way I used to deal with traitors." Rowan cut him off coldly. "But right now, information is more valuable than vengeance." They spent the rest of the night planning. Eric was sworn to absolute secrecy and given a position in intelligence where his discovery could be used properly. Marcus assembled a small team of completely trusted wolves who could investigate without raising alarms. And Rowan prepared to play a game he had thought he was done with, pretending to be the fool while setting traps for the people trying to destroy him. The next council meeting was one of the hardest performances of Rowan's life. He sat at the head of the table, looking appropriately concerned as various members reported worsening conditions across the Empire. And when Evander spoke, offering advice in that grandfatherly tone that had once seemed so reassuring, Rowan had to physically restrain his wolf from ripping the old traitor's throat out. "Perhaps we should consider a strategic withdrawal from the Eastern Territories," Evander suggested. "Consolidate our forces closer to the capital until we understand what we're facing." It was perfect advice for someone trying to weaken the Empire. Pulling back would create power vacuums that rival pacts could exploit, cutting off valuable resources and making the Northern Empire look weak to every potential enemy. Rowan pretended to consider it seriously. "You might be right. What do the rest of you think?" The debate continued for another hour, with Evander subtly steering every discussion toward decisions that would ultimately harm them. And Rowan played along, asking questions, seeming uncertain, giving the old wolf exactly what he wanted to see. When the meeting finally ended, Evander lingered as others filed out. He approached Rowan with an expression of concern that would have fooled anyone who didn't know the truth. "You're handling this well, Your Majesty. I know it's difficult, questioning everything you used to believe." "Learning always is," Rowan replied evenly. "Thank you for your guidance through all of this." "Of course. I've served the Vale line for 40 years. I'll continue serving until my last breath." "I'm sure you will," Rowan said, and the double meaning hung in the air between them, invisible to everyone except himself. Over the following week, Rowan's investigators worked in absolute secrecy. They followed money trails and intercepted communications. They identified co-conspirators and mapped out the full extent of the betrayal. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Evander hadn't been working alone. He had recruited 5 other council members, 2 high-ranking military officers, and at least a dozen regional administrators. Together, they had created a shadow government within the Northern Empire, systematically transferring power and resources to a coalition of rival pacts who had promised them positions of authority once Rowan was eliminated. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Use Rowan's reforms against him, encourage change while sabotaging implementation, create chaos that looked like the natural result of weak leadership. Then, when the empire was sufficiently destabilized, orchestrate a coup that would install a puppet king while Evander and his conspirators held the real power. They had been planning this for over 3 years, waiting patiently for the right moment. And Celine's departure had given them exactly the opening they needed. A king distracted by heartbreak, making unprecedented changes, vulnerable in ways he had never been before. Marcus brought the final evidence to Rowan late one night, his expression sick with betrayal. "This is everyone. These are all the names." Rowan scanned the list, seeing people he had trusted, people who had served loyally for years. Or so he thought. Turned out loyalty was just another mask that clever wolves wore while sharpening their knives in the dark. "When do we move?" Marcus asked. "Tomorrow night, during the full council session. I want everyone in one place where they can't run or warn each other. That's risky. If they suspect anything, they won't," Rowan said with cold certainty, "because I'm going to give them exactly what they want." Gotchant. The following evening, Rowan called an emergency council session. All 15 members attended, including the 6 conspirators who thought they were about to witness the final collapse of their king's authority. Rowan stood at the head of the table, looking appropriately exhausted and defeated. The performance was easier than it should have been. Part of him really did feel broken by the betrayal, hollowed out in ways that had nothing to do with acting. "I've made a decision," he announced quietly. "Effective immediately, I'm stepping down from active rule. The council will assume full governing authority while I retreat to a ceremonial position." Shocked silence. Even the conspirators looked surprised, though Rowan could see the triumph hiding behind their fake concern. "Your Majesty," Evander said carefully, "that's a drastic step. Perhaps we should discuss—" "There's nothing to discuss," Rowan cut him off. "I tried to change, tried to be better, but clearly I'm not suited for the kind of leadership this empire needs. Better to step aside and let more capable people handle it." He could see them struggling not to smile. This was better than they had hoped, a peaceful transition rather than a messy coup, a king who voluntarily surrendered power. "Of course," Rowan continued, his tone still mild, "there's the small matter of treason to address first." The room temperature dropped 20 degrees. Every conspirator went rigid, their expressions shifting from triumph to sudden fear. Rowan nodded to Marcus, who had been standing silent by the door. His security chief opened it, and 20 armed guards filed in, surrounding the table with weapons drawn. "Evander," Rowan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, along with council members Brennan, Lydia, Marcus Fell, Helena, and Victor. "You are all under arrest for high treason, conspiracy, embezzlement, and attempted assassination of your rightful king. Absolute chaos. 3 of the accused tried to run and were immediately restrained." Evander remained seated, his ancient face perfectly calm, as if he had expected this moment all along. "You have no proof," the old wolf said coldly. Rowan pulled out the stack of documents Eric had found and dropped them on the table with a heavy thud. "Financial records, correspondence with enemy pacts, supply orders signed in your hand. 3 years of systematic betrayal, all documented in excruciating detail." Evander's expression didn't change. "So you've learned to think like a real king after all. I wondered if you had it in you." The casual admission of guilt sent rage surging through Rowan's veins. His claws extended involuntarily, scraping against wood as he fought for control. "Why?" The question came out raw. 40 years of service, 3 generations. Why betray us now?" "Because you were weak," Evander said simply. "All of you. Your grandfather was too idealistic. Your father was too rigid. And you were too broken by fear to ever truly lead. Someone had to have the courage to do what needed doing. And what was that? Selling us out to our enemies? Tearing down everything we built? No, Evander replied, leaning forward. Building something new from the ashes of your failure. You were never going to be the king we needed, Rowan. Not the cold tyrant you were before, and certainly not the bleeding heart you've become. So I made arrangements for someone competent to take over once you inevitably destroyed yourself. The other conspirators were silent, watching the confrontation with varying degrees of fear and defiance. But Evander seemed almost relaxed, as if being caught had lifted a burden he had carried too long. You used my grief, Rowan said quietly. You saw me mourning Celine and decided it was the perfect time to strike. I used your weakness, Evander corrected. The grief just made it obvious. You spent 15 years pushing away the one person who could have made you whole, then fell apart when she finally left. That's not tragedy, boy. That's stupidity. And stupid kings get exactly what they deserve. Something snapped inside Rowan. Not his control exactly, but his willingness to keep pretending civilization mattered more than survival. The old wolf who had advised and betrayed and manipulated 3 generations of his family sat there looking smug, confident that consequences couldn't touch him. Rowan moved faster than anyone could track. One moment he stood at the head of the table. The next, he had Evander by the throat, lifted off his chair, and pinned against the stone wall hard enough to crack bone. The guards moved to intervene, but Marcus waved them back. This needed to happen. You think I'm weak? Rowan snarled, his face inches from the traitors. You think trying to be better makes me less dangerous? Let me remind you what I am underneath all the reforms and mercy. His claws pressed into Evander's throat, drawing thin lines of blood. The old wolf struggled, but age had taken his strength while Rowan was in his prime and absolutely done with being manipulated. I could kill you right now, Rowan continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Rip out your throat and let you bleed across the floor. It would be easy. It would feel good. And everyone in this room would understand exactly why I did it. Evander's eyes showed fear for the first time. Do it then, he gasped. Prove me right. Show everyone you're still the monster pretending to be civilized. The challenge hung in the air, and Rowan felt the weight of it pressing against everything he had been trying to become. The old him would have done it without hesitation, would have painted the walls with traitor blood and called it justice. But the new him, the version that was still forming and still vulnerable, hesitated. Because Evander was right about one thing. Killing him would prove that change was just performance. That underneath the reforms and the attempts at mercy, Rowan was still the same brutal king who valued power over everything else. But letting him live would show weakness to everyone watching, would suggest that treason could be survived if you were clever enough and old enough and connected enough. There was no good choice, no third option that satisfied both justice and growth. So Rowan made the only decision he could live with. He released Evander, letting the old wolf collapse to the floor, gasping and clutching his throat. Then he turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying absolute authority. Here's what's going to happen. All 6 conspirators will be imprisoned immediately. Their assets will be seized, their families will be investigated for complicity, and in 1 week, we will hold a public trial where every piece of evidence will be presented to the entire empire. You're giving them a trial? One of the loyal council members asked incredulously. I'm giving them transparency, Rowan corrected, because the old way of handling traitors was to execute them quietly and pretend the problem never existed. But that's how corruption flourishes. In the shadows, where no one asks questions. He looked down at Evander, still struggling to breathe on the floor. You wanted to prove I was weak. Wanted to show that change makes leaders vulnerable. So let's test that theory. Let's see if an empire built on accountability survives better than one built on fear. The speech probably sounded more confident than he felt. Inside, Rowan was screaming with rage and grief and the horrible knowledge that even trying to be better had been used as a weapon against him. But he held the mask firmly in place as guards hauled the conspirators away, held it through the emergency reorganization of the council, held it through hours of strategic planning to repair the damage that years of sabotage had caused. And only when he was finally alone in his chambers, with the door locked and no witnesses to judge him, did Rowan allow himself to fall apart. Folks, he didn't cry. Crying required emotional energy he no longer possessed. Instead, he sat on the floor of his chambers and stared at nothing while his mind processed the full scope of what had happened. 3 years of manipulation. 3 years of being subtly guided toward decisions that would ultimately destroy everything. And the worst part was realizing how blind he had been, so focused on his grief over Celine that he never noticed the knives being positioned against his back. A soft knock interrupted his spiral. Marcus entered without waiting for permission, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of something expensive. "You look like death," his security chief observed, sitting down beside him and pouring. "Feel like it too," Rowan replied, accepting the glass. They drank in silence for a while. Outside, the capital continued its nightly routines, unaware that their empire had nearly collapsed from within. "I didn't see it," Rowan said finally. "I was so busy trying to change myself that I didn't notice the people I trusted most were actively working to destroy me." "You trusted people who had given you no reason to doubt them," Marcus corrected. "That's not a failure. That's what trust looks like. Trust got me betrayed. Trust nearly got my empire carved up and distributed to our enemies. So tell me, what exactly is trust worth?" Marcus refilled both glasses before answering. "It's worth the possibility of real loyalty. The kind that doesn't require constant surveillance and threats. Evander betrayed you, yes, but the other 9 council members stayed loyal even when it would have been easier to join the conspiracy. That has to count for something." "Does it? Because right now it feels like trying to be better just painted a target on my back." "Maybe it did," Marcus agreed. "But going back to being the tyrant who trusts no one wouldn't have prevented this. Evander was planning his betrayal long before you started making changes. He would have found a different weakness to exploit." The words made sense intellectually, but Rowan's heart was still bleeding from the betrayal. He had opened himself up, tried to be vulnerable in ways that terrified him, and been proven right about every fear he had spent decades nursing. Love made you weak. Trust made you vulnerable. And caring about anything just gave your enemies ammunition to destroy you. "I can see where your thoughts are going," Marcus said quietly. "And I'm telling you right now, don't. Don't retreat back into isolation. Don't decide that being hurt proves you should never risk connection again." "Why not?" "It's safer." "Safer," Marcus agreed. "Also lonelier, colder, and ultimately just as destructive. You nearly died protecting Celine because somewhere under all the damage, you still believed some things were worth protecting. Don't let one old bastard's betrayal erase that." Rowan wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at him like gravity. His body ached from tension. His mind kept circling the same bitter thoughts. And underneath it all, he felt the old darkness rising, that familiar comfort of absolute control and zero vulnerability. It would be so easy to go back, to rebuild the walls he had started dismantling, to prove that the brutal king had been right all along and the man trying to change had been a fool. But somewhere in the ruins of his faith in people, a small, stubborn spark refused to die. The memory of Celine's face when she forgave him, the feeling of knowing he had saved her life, the tentative hope that maybe, possibly, trying to be better was worth the pain it caused. "Tomorrow," Rowan said finally, "tomorrow I'll decide whether to keep fighting for this or give up entirely. Tonight, I just need to survive being this damaged." "Fair enough," Marcus said. He stood and headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you know. The fact that you didn't kill Evander when you had the chance proves that, or proves I'm getting soft." "No," Marcus said firmly. "It proves you're getting smarter. Strength isn't about how much damage you can do. It's about how much you can endure without becoming the thing you hate." He left Rowan alone with that thought and a bottle that was rapidly emptying. The trial took place in the Great Hall, open to the public as Rowan had promised. Hundreds of wolves packed the space to witness their leaders held accountable in ways they had never seen before. Evidence was presented methodically, financial records showing systematic theft, correspondence proving coordination with enemy packs, testimony from witnesses who had seen the conspirators meeting in secret. By the end of the second day, guilt was undeniable. Even the accused had stopped trying to defend themselves, recognizing that the paper trail was too complete to refute. Evander stood for his final statement, looking smaller and older than Rowan remembered. The old wolf's eyes found Rowan's across the crowded hall, and something passed between them that might have been regret or defiance, or simply exhaustion. "I stand by everything I did," Evander said clearly. "I believed, and still believe, that this empire needed stronger leadership than you could provide. My methods were illegal, yes, but my intentions were to protect our people from the weakness I saw consuming us from within. He paused, surveying the assembled crowd. History will decide whether I was a traitor or a patriot. I accept whatever judgment this court delivers. The panel of judges conferred quietly. They had been chosen from outside the immediate court, neutral parties with no stake in protecting either side. After what felt like hours, the head judge stood. For the crimes of high treason, conspiracy, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit regicide, this court finds all 6 defendants guilty. The sentence is life imprisonment with all assets forfeit to repair the damage caused by their actions. Not death. Life imprisonment. It was simultaneously merciful and brutal, allowing the conspirators to live while ensuring they would never threaten the empire again. Rowan watched them be led away in chains and felt nothing but hollow victory. In the aftermath, rebuilding took months. New council members were carefully vetted and appointed. Financial systems were restructured to prevent future embezzlement. Treaties with neighboring pacts were renegotiated from scratch. And through it all, Rowan carried the weight of betrayal like chains around his chest, dragging him down even as he fought to keep the empire functioning. Word of what happened spread quickly across the continent. Some pacts praised his handling of the conspiracy. Others whispered that showing mercy to traitors proved he was weak. And somewhere in the Black Crescent territory, Celine heard the news and felt her heart break for the man who had tried so hard to change, only to have that change weaponized against him. She found Kyle in their study one evening, the report spread across his desk. He tried to be better, she said quietly, and they nearly destroyed him for it. Kyle looked up, his expression thoughtful. He's still standing, though. That counts for something. Does it? Or is he just bleeding slower than his enemies hoped? Time will tell, Kyle said. But for what it's worth, I think surviving betrayal without becoming the betrayer takes more strength than most wolves possess. Celine wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that Rowan would emerge from this stronger rather than more broken. But she knew him well enough to understand how deeply trust issues ran, and how thoroughly Evander's manipulation would have confirmed every fear Rowan had spent years nursing. And now, thousands of miles apart, there was nothing she could do to help him through it. Winter came to the Northern Empire with unusual ferocity. Snow piled against the palace walls, and winds screamed through the mountains like wolves mourning their dead. Rowan stood on his balcony, watching ice crystals form on stone, and wondered if he had finally reached his limit. He had survived assassination attempts, survived losing Celine, survived nearly dying to protect her, and now survived the discovery that people he trusted had been actively working to destroy him for years. How much more could one wolf endure before something essential broke permanently? Behind him, the door opened. Marcus appeared with more reports, more problems that required the king's attention. We've had 3 more border incidents, his security chief said quietly. Small raids, nothing major, but it's clear someone is testing our defenses. Of course they are, Rowan said flatly. Everyone knows we're vulnerable right now. They'd be stupid not to probe for weaknesses. What do you want to do about it? Rowan turned from the frozen landscape to face his oldest friend. And in Marcus's eyes, he saw genuine concern, the kind that came from watching someone you cared about slowly bleed out from wounds that wouldn't heal. What I want, Rowan said slowly, and what I'm capable of giving are becoming very different things. He walked past Marcus into his chambers, moving toward the cabinet where he kept Celine's portrait. The painting looked exactly as it always had, capturing a moment of brightness from years ago when everything had seemed possible. I tried, Rowan said to the portrait. I really tried to be the person who deserved you. But maybe Evander was right. Maybe I'm just too broken to ever be anything except what I was. Marcus moved to stand beside him. You're exhausted, you're hurt, and you're making decisions from the worst possible mental place. Am I? Or am I finally seeing clearly for the first time in months? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, snow continued falling, burying the capital under layers of white that made everything look clean and new. But Rowan knew that underneath the pristine surface, the same corruption and betrayal and violence still festered, waiting for spring to expose it all again. And he was so incredibly tired of fighting battles that never truly ended. I need to make a choice, he said finally. Either commit completely to this new path despite everything it's cost me, or accept that trying to change was a mistake and go back to being what I was before. Those aren't your only options, Marcus protested, aren't they? Because from where I'm standing, being vulnerable just gets you destroyed. Being merciful just gets you betrayed. And caring about people just gives them weapons to use against you. So you're going to stop caring? Stop trying? Become the tyrant again because it's safer? Rowan closed his eyes, every fiber of his being screaming for the simplicity of absolute control. No trust meant no betrayal. No vulnerability meant no wounds. No love meant no loss. It would be so easy. But then he remembered Celine's face when she forgave him. Remembered the feeling of saving her life even though she would never be his. Remembered that small spark of hope that maybe, possibly, being better than his worst instincts was worth the agony it caused. And he realized that going back would mean admitting that Evander had been right all along. That change was impossible. That broken wolves stayed broken forever. No, Rowan said quietly, opening his eyes. I'm not going back, but I'm not sure I can keep going forward either, so I need to find a third option. What does that look like? I don't know yet, Rowan admitted, but I'll figure it out, because the alternative is becoming exactly what everyone expects me to be, and I refuse to give them that satisfaction. It wasn't hope, exactly, but it was determination, and sometimes that was enough to keep breathing through the worst of it. Outside, winter deepened its hold on the empire. And inside, a king stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between the safety of old brutality and the danger of continued growth, knowing that either choice would define not just his own future, but the future of everyone who depended on him. The decision would have to be made soon. But not tonight. Tonight's survival was enough. The attack came 3 weeks after the trial ended, and it came with a brutality that suggested careful planning and absolute commitment to destruction. Rowan was in the war room when the first reports arrived. Marcus burst through the door without knocking, his face ashen in a way that immediately set every alarm in Rowan's body screaming. Eastern border, Marcus gasped. Full-scale invasion. 3,000 wolves, maybe more. They hit 4 villages simultaneously, and they're pushing toward the capital. Who? Everyone, Marcus said, and the word carried the weight of nightmare made real. The conspiracy didn't end with Evander. The packs he was coordinating with are making their move. They're calling it liberation, claiming the Northern Empire has been ruled by a tyrant too long. Rowan's hands flattened against the map table, his claws gouging wood as his mind raced through calculations. 3,000 against their standing army of maybe 1,500, scattered across multiple garrisons. Numbers that made victory impossible through conventional means. How long until they reached the capital? 2 days if they maintain current pace. Less if they push hard. 2 days to prepare for a siege they couldn't win. 2 days to decide whether to stand and fight or abandon the city and retreat to more defensible positions deeper in the mountains. 2 days to prove whether everything he had tried to become meant anything in the face of existential threat. Evacuate the civilians, Rowan ordered, his voice dropping into the cold tactical register of a commander who had fought and won wars nobody thought were survivable. Get them into the mountain passes with supplies and protection. Recall every garrison we have, and send riders to every ally we still have. If they ever meant their oaths, now is when we find out. Marcus nodded and rushed to execute orders. Alone in the war room, Rowan stared at the map showing enemy positions converging like a vice around his capital. This was it. The moment where change either proved itself viable or collapsed under the weight of reality. The test he had been dreading since the day he decided to try being something other than a brutal tyrant. And he was terrified it would prove Evander right. The capital transformed into a fortress within hours. Civilians streamed out through the northern gates, carrying what they could while soldiers herded them toward safety. Defensive positions were reinforced, weapons distributed. Every wolf capable of fighting was armed and positioned. Rowan moved through the preparations with mechanical efficiency, issuing orders and making tactical decisions while part of his mind remained locked on a single devastating realization. He was going to die defending this city. The numbers didn't lie. 3,000 trained warriors against less than 2,000 defenders, many of whom were barely trained civilians who had volunteered when they heard the Empire was under attack. They could hold for a while, maybe inflict enough damage to make the invaders reconsider, but ultimately the math was brutal and unforgiving, which meant this was his last stand. The final test of whether a king who tried to change deserved to be remembered for anything beyond his failures. Marcus found him on the battlements as sunset painted the sky in shades of blood and ash. His security chief looked grim but determined, the expression of a man who had chosen his death ground and made peace with it. "Riders are out," Marcus reported. "No idea if anyone will actually answer the call. Most of our allies are too far away to arrive in time anyway." "Then we fight with what we have," Rowan said simply. They stood in silence, watching the horizon where smoke from burning villages marked the enemy's advance. Somewhere out there, 3,000 wolves were coming to tear apart everything Rowan had built, everything he had tried to become. And all he could think about was Celine. She would hear about this eventually, would learn that he died defending an empire that half the continent thought deserved to fall. Would she mourn him? Would she feel vindicated that trying to change had gotten him killed? Would she remember the good parts or only the damage he had caused? "You're thinking about her," Marcus observed quietly. "Always," Rowan admitted. "Even now, knowing I'm probably going to die in 2 days, half my mind is wondering what she would think of all this." "What do you think she would think?" Rowan considered that. "She would tell me to fight like hell, to prove that trying to be better was worth it even if it gets me killed, to show that change isn't weakness, it's the hardest thing strong people can do." Sounds like good advice. Yeah, doesn't make it less terrifying. Night fell over the capital, and with it came the weight of knowing tomorrow would bring violence on a scale the Northern Empire hadn't seen in decades. Rowan walked the battlements, speaking to soldiers, checking defensive positions, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. But when he was finally alone in his chambers, door locked and no witnesses to judge him, Rowan allowed himself one moment of vulnerability. He pulled out parchment and began writing. Not battle orders or strategic documents, but a letter addressed to someone hundreds of miles away who would probably never read it. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as everything he had never said poured out onto paper. Apologies for failures he couldn't fix. Gratitude for years she spent holding his empire together. Admissions of love that came too late to matter, but needed to be spoken anyway. And finally, at the end, a single paragraph that felt like both confession and epitaph. "If I die tomorrow defending this empire, I need you to know it won't be in vain. Everything I'm fighting for, every reform I've tried to implement, every attempt to be better than the brutal king I was, it all comes back to you. You showed me what I could become if I was brave enough to try. And even though I lost you, even though I'll probably lose everything else too, I don't regret a single moment of trying to be worthy of what you gave me." He sealed the letter and left it on his desk with instructions for Marcus to deliver it if Rowan didn't survive. Then he stripped off his formal clothes and put on battle armor, leather, and steel that had seen him through 3 decades of warfare. The wolf in the mirror looked older than he remembered. Scars crossed his face and neck, souvenirs from battles that should have killed him but didn't. Gray threaded through his dark hair at the temples. Lines creased the corners of his eyes from squinting at maps and carrying the weight of too many impossible decisions. But underneath the damage, something else looked back at him. Something harder and more determined than the broken king who had watched Celine walk away months ago. He had survived losing her, survived assassination attempts, survived betrayal from people he trusted, and tomorrow he would survive 3,000 wolves trying to tear his empire apart, or he would die trying. Either way, he wouldn't go quietly. So, the enemy arrived at dawn, and they arrived like a tsunami of fur and fangs, an absolute conviction that the Northern Empire's time had ended. Rowan stood on the main battlements watching the army spread across the valley below. 3,000 wolves arranged in precise formations, their combined howl shaking the air like thunder. At their center, mounted on a massive warhorse, was Alpha Garrett Stone of the Western Reaches, a wolf Rowan had fought beside years ago before politics and ambition turned them into enemies. Garrett raised his hand, and the howling stopped. In the sudden silence, his voice carried across the distance with supernatural clarity. "Rowan Vale," he shouted. "Your empire is broken. Your council was corrupt. Your rule has brought nothing but suffering to territories that deserve better. Surrender now, and we'll show mercy to your people." Rowan stepped to the edge of the battlements, close enough that archers below could probably hit him if they tried. Behind him, Marcus hissed a warning, but Rowan ignored it. "Let me tell you something about mercy, Garrett," Rowan called back, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Mercy isn't something you offer after bringing 3,000 wolves to burn villages and kill civilians. Mercy is what I'm showing by not executing the conspirators who tried to hand my empire over to you. So take your liberation and shove it up your ass. If you want this city, you're going to bleed for every inch." The enemy army stirred, a ripple of anger and anticipation. Garrett's expression hardened into something ugly. "So be it," he said coldly. "When this is over, I'll mount your head on a pike and display it at every border crossing as a reminder that tyrants always fall." "You're welcome to try," Rowan replied. "I've been hearing that threat for 30 years, still waiting for someone to make it stick." He turned his back on the enemy army with deliberate contempt, walking calmly back to his command position while arrows started falling around him. None hit, either through luck or because the archers weren't quite ready, but the message was clear. The war had begun. The first assault came within the hour. 1,000 wolves charging the main gate with siege ladders and battering rams, screaming war cries that echoed off the mountains. Rowan's defenders met them with arrows and oil and everything they had, turning the approach into a killing ground. Bodies piled up at the base of the wall. Wolves fell screaming from ladders as defenders pushed them back. The battering ram made it to the gate and started pounding, each impact shaking the entire fortress, but Rowan had reinforced that gate personally, and it held. For now. The assault lasted 3 hours before Garrett pulled his forces back to regroup. They left 200 dead in the snow, blood turning the white ground into something that looked like a butcher's floor. Rowan's forces had lost 30, which felt like a victory until he did the math and realized they couldn't sustain that ratio. At this rate, the defenders would be overwhelmed by sheer attrition within days. "We need reinforcements," Marcus said, stating the obvious. "Without them, we're just dying slowly." "Then we die slowly and take as many of them with us as possible," Rowan replied. "Make them regret every step forward. Make them pay so much for this city that even if they win, they'll wish they hadn't tried." The second assault came at dusk, and this time Garrett showed more creativity. While 1,000 wolves hit the main gate as distraction, another 500 scaled the walls at 3 different points, spreading the defenders too thin to hold everywhere. Rowan fought personally at the northern breach, his claws and teeth tearing through wolves who made it over the battlements. Beside him, Marcus wielded a massive sword, cutting down enemies with brutal efficiency. Around them, defenders held the line through sheer desperate courage, knowing that if the wall fell, everything behind it would burn. The fighting was savage and personal. No formations, no tactics, just wolves trying to kill each other in confined space where every advantage mattered. Rowan took wounds he barely noticed, focused entirely on keeping the breach contained while his body moved on instinct, honed through decades of surviving impossible battles. A massive wolf tackled him from the side, driving them both off the battlements and down into the courtyard below. They hit cobblestones hard enough to crack bone, rolled apart, came up fighting. The enemy was huge, scarred, clearly one of Garrett's elites sent specifically to kill the Northern Alpha. They circled each other, both bleeding, both beyond exhaustion, but too committed to stop. The enemy lunged and Rowan met him head-on, their bodies colliding with force that would have killed normal wolves. Claws raked, teeth found flesh. Blood sprayed across ancient stone as they fought with the ugly desperation of predators, who understood only one of them was walking away. Rowan found an opening and took it. His jaws closed around the enemy's throat and crushed, feeling the life drain out through his teeth. The body went limp and fell, and Rowan staggered, barely keeping his feet as pain from a dozen wounds tried to drag him down. The breach had been contained. Bodies littered the courtyard, defenders and invaders mixed together in death. But the wall still stood, and the gate still held, and somehow they had survived another assault. Marcus appeared, limping but alive, his armor dented and covered in blood that probably wasn't all his own. "Third time today we should have died," he observed. "Day's not over yet," Rowan replied, and right then the southern wall exploded. The blast threw him off his feet, ears ringing from the concussion. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw a massive hole where solid stone had been moments before. Sappers. Garrett had sent wolves underground to mine the wall while everyone was distracted by the frontal assaults. And now 1,000 fresh enemy soldiers poured through the breach like water through a shattered dam. "Fall back!" Rowan roared, his voice barely audible over the screaming. Inner defensive positions, make them fight for every building. The next hours dissolved into nightmare. House-to-house combat through streets Rowan had walked his entire life, now transformed into killing grounds. Defenders fell back step by bloody step, making the enemy pay for every inch but losing ground nonetheless. Rowan fought like something beyond human, beyond wolf, tapping into reserves he didn't know existed. His body was a map of wounds, his armor shredded, his breath coming in gasps that tasted like blood. But he kept moving, kept fighting, kept refusing to let the city fall while he still drew breath. Somewhere in the chaos, he lost track of Marcus, lost track of time, lost track of everything except the immediate violence of staying alive moment to moment while his empire burned around him. When he finally had a second to breathe, stumbling into a temporary command post in what used to be a merchant shop, Rowan realized the full horror of their situation. They had been pushed back to the Inner Palace district, maybe 300 defenders left, all wounded, all exhausted beyond anything sustainable. The enemy still had over 1,000 wolves, and they were preparing for the final push that would crack the last defensive line and end this. It was over. They had fought brilliantly, made the invaders bleed for every step, but numbers and exhaustion had finally caught up with them. Rowan stood in the ruins of his capital, surrounded by wolves who had followed him knowing they would probably die, and tried to find words that would make this mean something. Before he could speak, a howl split the night, then another, then 100 more coming from the north where no allies should be. Everyone froze, defenders and attackers alike, as the impossible happened. An army crested the ridge overlooking the city, thousands of wolves bearing banners from a dozen different packs, all moving together in coordinated formation. And at their head, riding side by side, were two alphas Rowan had never expected to see, Kyle Draven and Celine. The reinforcements hit Garrett's forces like an avalanche. Fresh troops against exhausted invaders, the impact was devastating. The enemy line that had been preparing to overrun the palace district shattered under the sudden assault from behind, dissolving into chaos as they tried to regroup. Rowan watched from the command post, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. Celine fought at the front of the Black Crescent forces, her movements graceful and lethal as she cut through enemies with the skill of someone who had spent years proving herself on battlefields Rowan had taken for granted. And Kyle fought beside her, protecting her flanks, moving with the synchronized precision of mates who trusted each other absolutely. But they weren't alone. Rowan recognized banners from packs across the continent, allies he had reached out to. Neutral territories he had never expected to take sides. Even former enemies who apparently decided that whatever grudges they held against the Northern Empire mattered less than opposing the kind of invasion that threatened everyone's autonomy. Celine had done this. She had gathered them, convinced them, brought them here just in time to prevent total collapse. She had saved him. Again. Marcus appeared at his shoulder, bloodied but grinning like a maniac. "That's your Luna out there," he said. "Not mine," Rowan corrected quietly. "Not anymore." "But she came anyway," Marcus pointed out. "Question is, are you going to stay in here watching, or are you going to get out there and help her finish this?" The challenge cut through Rowan's shock. He grabbed a fresh weapon from the armory, ignored his body's screaming protests, and charged back into the battle with Marcus at his side and something that felt like hope burning in his chest. The fighting was brutal but decisive. Caught between defenders who refused to quit and reinforcements who were fresh and coordinated, Garrett's invasion force crumbled. Some tried to retreat, others fought to the death. Most simply surrendered when they realized the situation had become impossible. By the time dawn broke over the capital, the battle was over. Rowan stood in the ruins of his courtyard, surrounded by bodies and blood and the wreckage of buildings that would take years to rebuild. His entire body hurt with an intensity that suggested serious internal damage. But he was alive. His city was standing, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they had won. Kyle found him first. The Black Crescent. Alpha looked like he had gone through his own personal war, armor dented and covered in gore. But he was smiling, the fierce grin of a warrior who had just done something impossible. "You're welcome," Kyle said. "Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it," Rowan replied. "How did you know?" "We didn't," Kyle admitted. "But Celine heard about the invasion and decided we couldn't let you face it alone. She spent 2 weeks riding between territories, calling in every favor, making promises I'm still not sure we can keep, convincing wolves who had no reason to care that this mattered. She's terrifying when she's determined. She always was, Rowan said quietly. Kale's expression grew more serious. She's waiting for you. At the north gate. Thought you might want to speak with her before we begin the cleanup. Rowan nodded, unable to find words adequate for the magnitude of what had just happened. Kale clapped him on the shoulder once, a gesture of respect between warriors who had fought together, then left to organize his troops. The walk to the north gate felt like the longest journey of Rowan's life. Every step hurt, every breath rasped, but he forced his body forward, compelled by something stronger than pain or exhaustion. Celine stood alone near the gate, looking out over the valley where the reinforcements had first appeared. She had removed her helmet, and her hair caught the early morning light in shades of silver and gold. The mate mark on her throat glowed softly, a constant reminder of bonds Rowan could never claim. She turned as he approached, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the space of the courtyard. "You came," Rowan said finally, his voice rough. "Of course I came," Celine replied. "Did you really think I would let you die defending something you were trying so hard to make better? I wouldn't have blamed you. After everything, you had every right to let me face the consequences of my choices alone." Celine moved closer, her eyes scanning his wounds with the clinical assessment of someone who had seen too many battlefield injuries. "You look like you fought 1,000 wolves personally." "Feels like it too," Rowan admitted, "but we held, because you gave us time to hold, because you brought an army when we had nothing left." "I brought allies who understand that what you're trying to do here matters," Celine corrected. "The reforms you've implemented, the attempt to build something better than endless warfare and brutal dominance, it's revolutionary. Half the continent is watching to see if it works. The other half is trying to destroy it before it spreads. And you? What do you think?" Celine was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think you're trying to become the king I always believed you could be, and I think that's worth protecting, even if I can't be part of it the way I used to be." The pain in Rowan's chest had nothing to do with physical wounds. "Why, Celine? Why save someone who hurt you so badly?" "Because you're changing," she said simply. "Because watching you almost die protecting me at the Blood Moon Gathering showed me that growth is real, even when it's painful and imperfect. And because I need to believe that broken things can be repaired, that people can become better than their worst moments. If I gave up on that, I'd have to give up on everything." The words hit him like absolution he didn't deserve. Celine reached out and touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the scar across his cheek. "You're going to be okay," she said softly. "Your empire is going to survive this. And someday, when you've healed from all of it, you're going to find someone who can love the person you've become without carrying the weight of who you used to be." "I don't want someone else," Rowan said, the truth escaping before he could stop it. "I want you. I'll always want you. But I understand that's not an option anymore." "No," Celine agreed, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's not. But that doesn't mean what we had was meaningless. It just means we grew into different people who need different things." She pulled her hand back, and the loss of contact felt like another wound. "I need to go," she said. "Kale and I have to coordinate with the other allied packs, make sure Garrett's remaining forces actually surrender instead of regrouping. But before I do, I need to tell you something." "What?" Celine met his eyes directly, her expression fierce and proud. "I'm not sorry I left you, Rowan, but I am proud of what you're becoming. Keep fighting for this. Keep trying to be better. Because even if we can't be together, I need to know that the man I loved for 15 years is finally becoming the king he was always meant to be." Then she turned and walked away, returning to Kyle and the army she had assembled to save an empire that was no longer hers to protect. Rowan stood in the ruins of his capital and watched her go, feeling something shift inside his chest. Not healing, exactly, but maybe the beginning of acceptance. The understanding that some loves couldn't be repaired but could still matter. That losing her had been necessary for both of them to become who they needed to be. Marcus appeared at his side again, silent but present in the way only old friends could manage. "She saved us," Rowan said quietly. "She did," Marcus agreed. "Question is, what are you going to do with that second chance?" Rowan looked around at his damaged city, at the wolves who had fought beside him, at the beginnings of something different struggling to survive in a world that wanted it dead. "Everything," he said finally. "I'm going to do everything necessary to make this work, to prove that her faith wasn't misplaced, to build something worth the sacrifice. Then we'd better get started, Marcus said, because half the continent just watched you survive an impossible siege, and they're going to want to know what comes next. What came next was the hardest work of Rowan's life. Not fighting, not conquering, but the slow, patient labor of rebuilding both an empire and himself simultaneously. The cleanup took weeks. Bodies buried, buildings repaired, survivors relocated and given compensation for their losses. Garrett Stone was captured trying to flee and brought back in chains to face justice. This time, there would be no trial. The Western Alpha had violated every law of warfare, targeted civilians, and tried to destroy an empire through conquest. The execution was public, swift, and absolutely necessary to establish that some lines couldn't be crossed. But Rowan took no pleasure in it. Just another grim task in an endless list of responsibilities that came with being the wolf at the top. Messages of support arrived from across the continent. Pacts that had stayed neutral during the invasion now requested diplomatic relations. Territories that had been suspicious of his reforms suddenly wanted to know more. And beneath it all, a subtle shift in how people viewed the Northern Empire. Not as a brutal dictatorship held together by fear, but as something new struggling to be born. An experiment in whether strength and compassion could coexist, whether a king could be both decisive and merciful, whether change was actually possible. Kyle and Celine stayed for 3 weeks, helping coordinate the Allied forces and ensuring the transition back to peace was orderly. During that time, Rowan saw them together constantly, saw how Kyle looked at Celine with open adoration, saw how she laughed at his jokes and leaned into his strength without losing any of her own, saw everything he should have given her and didn't. It hurt. Every single day watching them together hurt like a fresh wound, but underneath the pain was something else. Gratitude that she had found someone who could give her what she deserved, relief that his failure hadn't destroyed her completely, and a strange kind of peace that came from accepting things he couldn't change. On their last night in the capital, Rowan hosted a private dinner for the Allied Alphas who had answered Celine's call. 30 leaders gathered in the restored Great Hall, sharing food and stories of the battle with the easy camaraderie of wolves who had survived something impossible together. Rowan stood to give the traditional closing toast, and silence fell as everyone turned to listen. 3 months ago, he began, I was a king who believed strength meant never showing weakness, never admitting mistakes, never allowing anyone close enough to matter. And that philosophy nearly destroyed me and everyone who depended on me. He paused, looking around the room at faces that ranged from respectful to skeptical to openly curious. What I learned, what this siege proved beyond any doubt, is that real strength isn't about being invulnerable. It's about being willing to change, to admit when you're wrong, to ask for help when you need it, and most importantly, to keep trying even when every attempt seems to blow up in your face. A few wolves chuckled at that, remembering the chaos of the past months. So I want to thank every one of you for answering a call you had no obligation to answer, for fighting beside wolves you might have considered enemies last year, for proving that the future doesn't have to look like the past. He raised his glass, and 30 others rose with it, to unlikely allies, to second chances, and to building something better than what came before, even if it kills us trying. They drank together, and for a moment the hall felt less like a war council and more like the beginning of something genuinely new. Later, after most guests had retired, Rowan found himself alone on his balcony one final time. The city spread below him, damaged but healing, lights marking homes where people slept without fear of immediate violence. Behind him, the door opened quietly. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Couldn't sleep? Celine asked, moving to stand beside him at the railing. Too much on my mind. They stood in comfortable silence, shoulders almost touching, watching the night together like they had 1,000 times in the years before everything fell apart. We're leaving tomorrow, Celine said finally, back to Black Crescent territory. There's a lot of work waiting for us there. I know. Thank you again for everything. I'll never be able to repay what you did. I don't want repayment, Celine said firmly. I want you to succeed. I want these reforms to work. I want the Northern Empire to become an example other territories can follow instead of a cautionary tale about what happens when you try to change too fast. No pressure then, Rowan said with dry humor. Celine smiled, a real smile that made his heart ache. You can handle it. You're stronger than you think, Rowan. You always have been. I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm one crisis away from complete collapse. That's called being honest about your limits, Celine said. It's different from weakness. Took me years to learn that distinction myself. She turned to face him directly, her expression serious. I need to tell you something before I leave. Something I should have said weeks ago. What? Celine took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Forgiving you was the easy part. The hard part was forgiving myself for staying so long in a situation that was slowly killing me, for accepting scraps of attention and calling it love, for believing that if I just worked hard enough and proved myself valuable enough, you would finally see me. Her voice dropped lower. I enabled your worst habits by never demanding better, by accepting treatment I should have rejected. And I'm sorry for that, because in some ways, I made it easier for you to stay broken. The confession hit Rowan hard, revealing dimensions of their shared history he had never considered. You have nothing to apologize for, he said roughly. Neither do you, Celine replied. Not anymore. We were both doing the best we could with the tools we had. It just wasn't enough to build something sustainable. She reached out and took his hand, and the simple touch felt like benediction. But I need you to promise me something, she continued. Promise me you'll find someone who sees you clearly, who loves you without needing you to be perfect, who makes you want to be soft instead of always being strong. I don't know if that person exists, Rowan admitted. They do, Celine said with certainty. And when you meet them, don't make the mistakes you made with me. Don't push them away because vulnerability scares you. Don't hide behind duty and control. Just let yourself be human for once. The future she described felt impossible from where Rowan stood, but he forced himself to nod. I'll try. That's all any of us can do, Celine said softly. Just keep trying until it finally works. She squeezed his hand once more, then let go and stepped back. Goodbye, Rowan. Goodbye, Celine. She left without looking back, and Rowan stood alone on the balcony watching the night sky, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into something he could finally carry without being crushed. He had lost her, had nearly lost his empire, had been betrayed by people he trusted and saved by people he had hurt. And through it all, he had somehow managed to survive without becoming the monster everyone expected. It wasn't victory, but it was survival with dignity intact, which was more than he had any right to expect. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Rebuilding the capital, solidifying alliances, implementing reforms that actually worked instead of just sounding noble, becoming the king his empire needed instead of the tyrant it feared. But tonight, Rowan allowed himself one moment of quiet grief for everything that could have been and never would be. Then he went inside, closed the door on the past, and prepared to face whatever came next with eyes wide open and a heart that was scarred but still beating. The story wasn't over, but this chapter had finally, mercifully, come to an end. And in the darkness before dawn, somewhere between morning and hope, Rowan Vale began the slow, patient work of learning how to live with the consequences of being brave enough to change. Even when change demanded everything and gave back only the possibility of something better. Even when the cost was measured in blood and loss and years of lonely work with no guarantee of success. Even then. Because some things were worth fighting for regardless of whether you personally benefited from the victory. And an empire built on accountability instead of fear, on partnership instead of domination, on the radical belief that strength and compassion weren't opposites was one of those things. So Rowan would fight for it, would bleed for it, would give everything he had left to make it real. Not because he expected reward or recognition or a second chance at love, but because it was the right thing to do. And after 30 years of doing everything else, maybe it was time to try that. 6 months after the siege, Rowan stood in the rebuilt council chamber and barely recognized the empire he had once ruled with absolute authority. The room was full of voices debating trade policies, representatives from 12 different territories arguing their positions with the kind of passion that came from actually believing their opinions mattered. This was what democracy looked like in its messy, chaotic infancy. And it was both harder and more rewarding than anything Rowan had imagined. The Northern Empire had survived its trial by fire, but survival had demanded transformation. The old system of absolute monarchy was gone, replaced by a hybrid structure where Rowan retained military command and executive authority, but shared legislative power with an expanded council that included representatives from common citizens, not just nobility. It was slow, it was frustrating, and it was the only way forward that didn't eventually lead back to the kind of concentrated power that had made Evander's betrayal possible. "Your Majesty," one of the newer council members said, pulling Rowan's attention back to the debate at hand, "the eastern villages are requesting additional funds for reconstruction. They argue that since they bore the worst of the invasion damage, they deserve priority allocation. And the northern mining communities argue that restoring production capacity should take precedence because it generates revenue for everyone," another representative countered. Rowan listened to both sides present their cases, resisting the old instinct to simply make a decision and move on. This new system required patience, required letting people work through disagreements instead of imposing solutions from above. It went against every leadership instinct he had spent 3 decades developing. But it was working. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and arguments and moments where he wanted to scream at everyone to just shut up and do what he said. But it was working. "We'll split the difference," Rowan said when the debate reached a natural pause. 60% to reconstruction, 40% to production restoration. Both are necessary. Both communities have valid needs. And if we're building an empire that actually serves its people, we don't get to pick favorites based on political convenience. There was grumbling from both sides, which Rowan had learned was the sign of a decent compromise. Nobody got everything they wanted, but nobody walked away empty-handed either. The session continued for another 2 hours, working through a dozen smaller issues with the same patient deliberation. By the time the council finally adjourned, Rowan's head was pounding, and he desperately needed air. Marcus found him on the eastern terrace, staring out at the city that had been rebuilt stone by stone over the past months. The capital looked different now, less imposing, more welcoming. Buildings had been redesigned with input from the people who would actually live in them. Streets were wider, better lit, planned for community rather than just military efficiency. "You look exhausted," Marcus observed. "I am exhausted," Rowan admitted. Running an empire where people actually have a say in their own governance is 10 times harder than just giving orders and expecting obedience. But worth it? Rowan considered the question seriously. "Yeah, worth it. Even when it makes me want to tear my hair out, it's worth knowing we're building something that might actually survive beyond my lifetime." Marcus moved to stand beside him, and for a moment they just watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of copper and gold. The security chief had been promoted to official chancellor, second in command, and the person responsible for keeping Rowan honest when old habits tried to resurface. "Message came from the Black Crescent Pack this morning," Marcus said casually. "Celine and Kael are hosting a summit in 2 months. Representatives from 15 territories discussing trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. They want you there." Rowan's chest tightened at the mention of Celine's name, even after all these months. The wound had healed, but the scar remained, and probably always would. "I'll go," he said quietly. "This is too important to let personal history interfere with political necessity." "You sure you can handle seeing them together?" "I've been handling it for 6 months," Rowan replied. "One more time won't kill me." But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. Every report he received about the Black Crescent Pack mentioned how well Celine and Kael were leading together, how their territory was thriving under their joint rule, how other packs were looking to them as a model for what partnership-based leadership could accomplish. Everything Rowan should have built with her, Kael was building instead. The jealousy still burned sometimes, hot and vicious in his gut. But underneath it was something else. Pride that she had found what she deserved, relief that his failure hadn't destroyed her completely, and a strange kind of peace that came from accepting that some losses were permanent and necessary. "You've changed," Marcus said, reading the direction of his thoughts with the ease of someone who had known him for decades. 6 months ago, the idea of watching her lead beside another alpha would have sent you into a rage spiral. Now you're actually processing it like a functional human being. "Don't give me too much credit," Rowan said dryly. "I still have moments where I want to challenge Kael to single combat and win her back through displays of dominance. But you don't." "But I don't," Rowan agreed, "because that's not how any of this works. And because she chose him freely, which means she deserves to be happy regardless of what I want." The words still hurt to say, but they were true. And Rowan had learned that truth was more important than comfort, even when truth felt like swallowing broken glass. Oshit. The weeks leading up to the summit were consumed with preparation. Rowan worked with his advisors to develop proposals that would benefit multiple territories, not just the Northern Empire. He studied reports on economic conditions across the continent. He practiced diplomacy with people who had once been enemies and were now tentative allies. And late at night, when everyone else was asleep, he stood on his balcony and wondered what it would feel like to see Celine again after 6 months of radio silence. They had exchanged formal correspondence, polite letters discussing policy and trade, but carefully avoiding anything personal. Rowan had drafted a dozen versions of a real letter, something honest and vulnerable, and everything he had never been brave enough to say when it mattered. But every version ended up in the fireplace, burned to ash, because what was the point of confessing feelings to someone who had already moved on? The journey to Black Crescent territory took 5 days. Rowan traveled with a small diplomatic delegation, Marcus, and a handful of advisors who could help negotiate the complex agreements that would be discussed. No military escort this time, just wolves trying to build something better through conversation instead of conquest. The Black Crescent Pact's main settlement was built into a valley surrounded by ancient forests, and it took Rowan's breath away with its raw beauty. Buildings blended seamlessly with the natural landscape, wooden structures that looked grown rather than built. Wolves moved through the streets with an ease that spoke of genuine community rather than enforced order. This was what a territory looked like when it was actually led by people who cared about their citizens' well-being. Kale met them at the main gate, looking confident and relaxed in a way that made Rowan's chest tight with complicated emotions. The Black Crescent Alpha had always been formidable, but now he carried himself with the added authority of someone who had proven himself in battle and governance both. "Rowan," Kyle said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Black Crescent. We're honored to host you." "The honor is mine," Rowan replied, clasping the offered hand and meaning it. "Thank you for organizing this. It's exactly the kind of collaboration the continent needs." They moved through pleasantries with the careful courtesy of 2 alphas who respected each other but would probably never be friends. Then Kyle led them toward the main hall where the summit would take place, and Rowan's heart started pounding in anticipation of the encounter he had been both dreading and craving for months. Celine was waiting in the hall, speaking with representatives from the eastern grasslands. She wore formal robes in deep green, her hair pulled back to display the mate mark that glowed softly on her throat. She looked healthy, happy, absolutely in her element as she discussed irrigation systems with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from actually caring about practical solutions to real problems. Then she looked up and saw him. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and Rowan saw surprise flash across her face, followed by something that might have been nervousness or anticipation, or simply the acknowledgement that this moment was going to be difficult for both of them. Then she smiled, a genuine expression of welcome, and excused herself from the conversation to approach him. "Rowan," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you came." "Wouldn't have missed it," Rowan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've built something remarkable here, Celine. I can see it in everything, from the infrastructure to the way people interact. This is what good leadership looks like." She looked pleased by the compliment, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "We've been fortunate. Kyle and I complement each other well. He handles military and external affairs while I focus on internal governance and community development. It shows," Rowan said honestly. "And it hurts to admit this, but you're clearly thriving in ways you never could have in the Northern Empire." Celine's expression softened with understanding. "We both needed different things, Rowan. That doesn't make what we had meaningless. It just means we grew into people who couldn't sustain each other anymore." The conversation was interrupted by other delegates arriving, forcing them to separate and attend to diplomatic responsibilities. But throughout the evening, Rowan found his eyes constantly drawn to her, watching how she moved through the crowd with confidence and grace, how she spoke with conviction about policy, how she laughed at something Kyle whispered in her ear, the kind of intimate moment that spoke of genuine partnership. And every glance was a reminder of what he had lost and would never get back. Okay. The summit lasted 3 days, and they were 3 of the most productive and painful days of Rowan's life. By day, he negotiated treaties and trade agreements with the fierce intelligence that had made him a successful, if brutal, king. By night, he watched Celine and Kyle host dinners and receptions with the kind of synchronized leadership that only came from truly understanding and trusting your partner. On the second evening, there was a formal banquet celebrating the preliminary agreements that had been reached. Rowan sat at the high table, making conversation with other alphas, while part of his attention remained fixed on the couple at the center of everything. Kael stood to give a toast, and the hall fell silent. 3 years ago, he began, the Black Crescent Pack was isolated, insular, and convinced that strength meant standing alone. Then I met someone who taught me that real power comes from partnership, from building networks of mutual support instead of trying to dominate everything through force. He turned to Celine, his expression full of open adoration that made something in Rowan's chest crack. My Luna has transformed not just our territory, but my understanding of what leadership should look like. She challenges me, she balances me, and she makes me better every single day. So this toast is to her, to all the Lunas and partners who make their alphas stronger, and to building a future where cooperation matters more than conquest. The hall erupted in applause and agreement. Celine stood beside Kael, smiling with the kind of happiness that comes from being genuinely valued, and Rowan applauded along with everyone else while dying a little inside. After the toast, people began mingling again. Rowan found himself near the balcony doors, desperately needing air and space from the overwhelming evidence of Celine's contentment. He stepped outside into the cool night, breathing deeply and trying to steady himself. Behind him, the door opened quietly. He knew without looking that it was her. "You're struggling," Celine said softly. "I can see it, even when you're trying to hide it." "I'm fine," Rowan lied. "No, you're not. And you don't have to pretend with me, Rowan. Not anymore." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight she looked exactly like she had in the portrait he kept hidden in his chambers. Beautiful, strong, and completely beyond his reach. "You're happy," he said, and it wasn't a question. "With him, with your life, with everything you've built. And I'm genuinely glad for you, Celine. But watching it, being confronted with physical proof that you're better off without me, it's harder than I expected." Celine moved closer, her expression full of compassion that somehow made it worse. "I know," she said gently. "If it helps at all, I think you're doing remarkably well. The reforms you've implemented, the way you're leading now versus how you led before, it's like watching someone completely rebuild themselves from the foundation up." "Doesn't feel like enough," Rowan admitted. "Feels like I'm constantly one mistake away from proving everyone right about me being fundamentally broken." "That's called being human," Celine said. "That's called having appropriate humility about your own limitations. The old you would have denied any possibility of error. The new you recognizes that perfection is impossible and keeps trying anyway." She reached out and touched his arm lightly, a gesture of comfort between two people who had shared history but no future. "I need to tell you something," she continued. "Something I've been meaning to say for months but could never find the right words for." "What?" Celine took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Not because I doubted it was necessary, but because I genuinely loved you. Despite everything, despite the loneliness and the neglect and the years of feeling invisible, I loved you with everything I had." Rowan's throat tightened dangerously. "I know. And I wasted it." "You did," Celine agreed bluntly. "But here's the thing I've learned in the past year. Love isn't enough by itself. You also need compatibility, timing, willingness to grow together, and the ability to see and value each other clearly. We had love, but we didn't have the rest. And trying to sustain a relationship on love alone is like trying to build a house with only a foundation and no walls." The metaphor hit hard, crystallizing something Rowan had felt but couldn't articulate. "So what do we do with that?" "We accept it," Celine said simply. "We acknowledge that what we had was real and important and ultimately insufficient. We let ourselves grieve the loss without pretending it didn't matter. And we move forward knowing that sometimes the right choice still hurts like hell." Tears gathered in Rowan's eyes, and he didn't bother trying to hide them. "I miss you. Every day, I miss you. Not just what we had, but who you were in my life. My anchor, my conscience. The person who saw me clearly and somehow decided I was worth standing beside anyway." "I miss you too," Celine admitted, her own eyes wet. "I miss the potential of what we could have been if we'd both been braver sooner. But that version of us only exists in imagination, Rowan. The real us, the actual people we were together, we were toxic, and staying would have destroyed us both eventually." "I know," Rowan said roughly. "Doesn't make letting go any easier. No, it doesn't, Celine agreed, but easy isn't the goal. Growth is. Healing is. Building lives we can actually sustain is. They stood together in the moonlight, two wolves who had loved each other imperfectly, and were now trying to figure out how to honor that love while accepting its limitations. Will it ever stop hurting? Rowan asked quietly. The grief? Probably not completely, but it gets quieter, more manageable, and eventually you'll build a life around it that feels full enough that the empty spaces don't consume everything else. How do you know? Because I'm already there, Celine said gently. I still carry what we were, but it doesn't define me anymore. I have Kael now. I have work that fulfills me. I have a territory that needs me and values what I contribute. The pain of losing you is still present, but it's just one thread in a much larger tapestry. I want that, Rowan admitted. I want to reach the point where remembering doesn't destroy me. You will, Celine promised. It just takes time and patience and the willingness to keep living instead of just surviving. She squeezed his arm once more, then stepped back toward the door. I should get back. People will notice if we're both gone too long, and I don't want to feed rumors that make things harder for either of us. Celine, Rowan called as she reached for the door handle. She paused, looking back at him with those gray eyes that had haunted his dreams for months. Thank you, he said, for everything. For the years you stood beside me. For leaving when staying would have killed you. For saving my empire when you had every right to let it burn. For this conversation. For all of it. You're welcome, she said softly. And thank you for finally becoming someone who can say those words and mean them. Then she was gone, leaving Rowan alone with the night and a grief that felt slightly more bearable than it had an hour ago. Ishimek. The summit concluded successfully, with treaties signed and new alliances formalized. Rowan returned to the Northern Empire with concrete achievements and a heart that was somehow both heavier and lighter than when he left. He threw himself into work with renewed focus. The Empire needed attention, needed constant vigilance to prevent backsliding into old authoritarian patterns. And Rowan discovered that having a purpose beyond his own emotional devastation made the days more bearable. Months passed, then a year. The Northern Empire continued evolving, sometimes stumbling, but generally moving in the right direction. Other territories began adopting similar reforms, creating a gradual shift across the continent toward more distributed power structures. And Rowan changed with it, becoming someone he barely recognized from the brutal king who had pushed Celine away. He learned to laugh again, started attending cultural events instead of just military exercises, made friends beyond people who were obligated to tolerate him through duty or fear, discovered that life could include small pleasures like good food and decent conversation and moments of genuine connection that didn't require dominance or control. He was becoming human, slowly and imperfectly, one deliberate choice at a time. 2 years after the siege, Marcus appeared in Rowan's study looking unusually thoughtful. There's someone here to see you, he said carefully. Aluna from the Eastern Grasslands delegation. She says it's personal, not official business. Rowan looked up from the trade reports he'd been reviewing, curiosity overriding his usual wariness. Send her in. The woman who entered was perhaps 40, with silver-streaked dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed him with the kind of directness he had learned to appreciate. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew her worth and didn't need validation from anyone. Luna Petra, she introduced herself. We met briefly at the Black Crescent Summit 2 years ago. I remember, Rowan said, though honestly his memories of that summit were dominated by Celine, and he barely recalled individual delegates. What can I do for you? Petra settled into the offered chair with easy grace. I'm here because mutual friends suggested we should meet properly. Apparently there's a conspiracy among the continent's Lunas to prevent you from dying alone and bitter. Rowan blinked, completely thrown by the blunt statement. Excuse me? Celine asked me to check on you, Petra clarified. She's concerned that you're so focused on governing that you've forgotten how to live. And since I'm recently widowed and apparently also in danger of disappearing into work to avoid processing grief, she thought we might benefit from comparing notes. The casual mention of Celine's ongoing concern made Rowan's chest tight. She asked you to intervene? She asked me to visit, Petra corrected. What we do with that visit is entirely up to us. I could deliver a polite message, have tea, and leave. Or we could have an actual conversation about what it's like to rebuild yourself after losing someone who defined your entire existence. There was something compelling about her directness, the complete absence of games or manipulation. Rowan found himself intrigued despite his usual resistance to emotional vulnerability with strangers. "All right," he said slowly, "let's have that conversation." They talked for 3 hours. Petra shared her story of loving and losing a mate who died in a border skirmish, of struggling to lead a territory while drowning in grief, of slowly learning that healing didn't mean forgetting. And Rowan found himself opening up in return, speaking honestly about Celine and the siege and the constant battle between who he was and who he was trying to become. By the time Petra finally left, Rowan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not attraction exactly, but the possibility of connection. The sense that maybe, eventually, he could build a relationship with someone who saw him clearly and wasn't intimidated by his sharp edges. It wasn't love, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, Petra visited regularly, sometimes for official diplomatic business, sometimes just to talk. Their conversations ranged from politics to philosophy to shared experiences of loss and reconstruction. And gradually, carefully, something shifted between them. Rowan didn't fall in love. Love felt like something he had already spent his allocation of, something he had given to Celine so completely that nothing remained for anyone else. But he discovered that affection could exist without consuming passion, that partnership could be built on respect and compatible goals rather than overwhelming chemistry, that maybe there were different kinds of love, and he was capable of accessing one that didn't require him to be someone he wasn't. 3 years after the siege, Petra accepted a formal position as Northern Empire's ambassador to the Eastern Territories. She moved into quarters near the palace, close enough for regular contact but far enough to maintain independence. They weren't bonded, weren't even officially courting by traditional standards, but they were building something, slowly, without drama or expectations beyond mutual respect and compatible company. And Rowan found himself grateful for the quiet steadiness of it, for having someone who knew his history but wasn't defined by it, who challenged him when he started sliding into old authoritarian patterns, who made him laugh and occasionally called him an idiot and understood that healing was nonlinear. One evening, sharing dinner in his private quarters, Petra set down her wine glass and looked at him seriously. "You need to know something," she said. "I'm never going to be Celine. I'm never going to fill that particular hole in your heart. And I'm okay with that. But you need to be okay with it too." "I know," Rowan said honestly. "And I don't want you to be her. I want you to be exactly who you are. Which is someone who sees me clearly and likes me anyway. Someone who makes me want to be better without demanding perfection. Someone who understands that we're both damaged and is willing to build something anyway." Petra smiled, the expression warm and genuine. "I can work with that. As long as you understand that I have my own damage and my own ghosts. My late mate was my great love. Nothing will ever replace what I had with him. But that doesn't mean I can't build something meaningful with you." "I understand," Rowan said. "And honestly, it's a relief. No expectations of overwhelming passion, just two scarred wolves trying to figure out how to be less alone." They touched glasses in a quiet toast to pragmatic companionship, and Rowan felt something settle in his chest that might have been peace. 5 years after the siege, Rowan stood in the same council chamber where he had once ruled with absolute authority and barely recognized the man he had been. The Northern Empire had transformed into something unprecedented, a hybrid system that balanced individual authority with collective governance. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments and setbacks and moments where Rowan wanted to scream at everyone to just shut up and let him make decisions unilaterally. But it was working, and more importantly, it was sustainable. Other territories had begun adopting similar reforms. The continent that had been defined by endless territorial conflicts and dominance battles was slowly, incrementally, finding better ways to manage power. And at the center of it all stood an alpha who had learned that real strength meant being vulnerable enough to change. News arrived that Celine and Kael were expecting their first child, and Rowan felt the announcement like a physical blow followed immediately by genuine joy. She was building the life she deserved, creating a family with someone who valued her completely. And Rowan was happy for her, even as the news reminded him of everything he would never have. He sent a gift, an intricately carved cradle made from northern pine by craftspeople who had once feared him and now voluntarily offered their finest work. The accompanying note was simple. Congratulations. Your child will be lucky to have you both. May they inherit your compassion and Kael's strength, and may they never know the kind of loneliness that comes from being raised by someone too broken to love them properly. The response came weeks later, a letter in Celine's precise handwriting. The cradle is beautiful and will be treasured. Thank you for your blessing and your honesty. We're naming our daughter Rowan if she's a girl, not because I'm asking permission, but because you deserve to know that you're remembered not just for the damage you caused, but for the growth you chose. The man you've become is someone worth honoring, even if the man you were needed to be left behind. Rowan read the letter 3 times, then carefully filed it away with the other fragments of their shared history. It didn't heal the wound completely, but it helped. Knowing that he was remembered for his transformation rather than just his failures mattered more than he could articulate. That evening, he found Petra in the library, reading reports on agricultural developments in the Southern Territories. She looked up as he entered, immediately recognizing something significant in his expression. "News?" she asked. "Celine's having a baby," Rowan said. "A girl, probably. They're naming her after me." Petra stood and moved to embrace him, understanding without needing explanation how complicated that honor felt. "How does that make you feel?" "Grateful," Rowan said honestly. "Sad. Proud. All of it simultaneously. It's like being given credit for becoming someone I should have been decades ago." "Better late than never," Petra said gently. "And better to be remembered for growth than for stagnation." They stood together in the quiet of the library, and Rowan felt the weight of 5 years of deliberate change settling into something he could finally carry without being crushed. Pathetic. 8 years after the siege, Rowan attended another continental summit, this one hosted in neutral territory with over 30 packs represented. The gathering was twice the size of the one Celine and Kael had organized, a testament to how much the political landscape had shifted. Celine was there with her family, Kael at her side, and a 6-year-old daughter who had inherited her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair. The child was named Rowan, as promised, and watching her run through the diplomatic reception with complete confidence was surreal and wonderful and painful all at once. During a break in proceedings, Celine approached him with her daughter in tow. The little girl looked up at him with frank curiosity, clearly having been told stories but needing to verify them personally. "This is Alpha Rowan Vale," Celine told her daughter gently. "The one you're named after. He's an old friend who helped me become the person I am today." "You're the king who learned to be nice," young Rowan said with a child's brutal honesty. "Mama says you used to be scary, but you got better." Rowan couldn't help but smile at the simplified but essentially accurate summary. "That's right. I used to be scary, but your mother taught me that being strong doesn't mean being cruel, and now I try to be the kind of king people respect instead of fear." "That's good," the child said seriously. "Fear is bad. Respect is better. Mama says so." "Your mama is very wise," Rowan agreed, meeting Celine's eyes over her daughter's head. Later, when the official events had ended and most delegates had dispersed, Rowan found himself alone with Celine one final time. They stood on a terrace overlooking mountains painted gold by sunset, and for a moment neither spoke. "She's beautiful," Rowan said finally. "Your daughter. She has your eyes and your determination. She's going to be formidable." "She already is," Celine said with obvious pride. "She argues with her tutors constantly, demands to know the reasoning behind every rule, and refuses to accept answers that don't make sense. Kael says she's exactly like I was at that age. Sounds exhausting." "It is," Celine agreed, laughing softly, "but it's also wonderful. Being a parent has taught me more about patience and unconditional love than anything else ever could." "I'm happy for you," Rowan said, and meant it completely. "You deserve everything you have, Celine. The family, the territory, the partnership with someone who actually values you. All of it." Celine turned to face him directly, and in the fading light, he could see the years marked on both of them. The lines around her eyes, the gray in his hair, the accumulated evidence of lives lived fully despite damage and grief. "I've been wanting to say this for years," she said quietly, "but I could never find the right moment, so I'm just going to say it now before I lose courage." "What?" "I forgive you, Rowan. Not in theory or as a diplomatic gesture, but genuinely and completely. I forgive you for the years of loneliness, for pushing me away, for not being able to see what was right in front of you until it was too late. I forgive all of it." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "And more than that, I'm proud of you. The work you've done, the person you've become, the legacy you're building, it's remarkable. You took the worst moment of your life and used it as fuel for genuine transformation. That takes courage most people never find." Rowan's throat closed completely, tears gathering despite his best efforts at control. "Thank you," he managed to rasp. "That means more than I can express." "I know," Celine said gently, "and I need you to do something for me now." "What?" "Forgive yourself. Stop carrying the weight of who you used to be like a punishment. Accept that you've changed, that you're still changing, and that growth is enough. You don't have to be perfect, Rowan. You just have to keep trying." The permission he hadn't realized he needed broke something open in his chest. For 8 years, he had been working toward transformation while simultaneously punishing himself for needing to transform in the first place, carrying guilt like armor, convinced that suffering was the price of redemption. But Celine was giving him permission to put it down, to accept that he had done the work and earned the right to stop flagellating himself for past failures. "I'll try," he said. "That's all I can promise. I'll try to believe I'm worthy of the life I'm building." "That's enough," Celine said. "Trying is always enough."